G'day and welcome to the Vassals of Kingsgrave. This is a Roundtable podcast in which the hosts of Krakencast will be talking about some of our favourite Australian movies. My name is Duncan, or Valkyrist from the forums, and today I am joined by Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah, also known as Lady Weaver on the forums.
Dana.
Teen Donor on the forums.
And our American ambassador, David.
Hi, David HHH on the forums.
So this episode is all about Australian cinema, which I think is an area of cinema that doesn't get a lot of attention, even in Australia itself. Most of the highest grossing films tend to come from other countries like America. Usually there's one notable film per year. I think last year it was Lion with Dev Patel.
Yeah.
So to begin, I was sort of interested in what your guys' relationship with Australian films are, and did they have much of a presence when you were growing up as compared to American films? Did you have like a family favorite? And do you seek out Australian films if they're in the cinema, or like some Australians, do you avoid them?
I know growing up, I loved Blinky Bill, like hands down, one of my favorites. So I love the Blinky Bill movies. They are a staple, I think, of my generation.
I think several generations.
Yeah, because it's a very popular character. And then they've even, I guess, tried to bring it in for the new generation with the new Blinky Bill movie that came out in the last few years, which I did not go and see. Sorry.
David, do you know who Blinky Bill is?
No idea what you're talking about. Which will probably be a recurring theme.
It's an animated koala that goes off on adventures, and he's joined by his friends. So, like, another one's a female koala, and a platypus, and all of the other ones.
Yeah, and Blinky Bill and Dot and the Kangaroo and all those films were fantastic because they used it was rotoscoped, so it was animation on live backgrounds, and that's what made them so beautiful. And they're just so dead and cold now.
So it was originally, I didn't know this, I only saw Blinky Bill as a TV show, but it was originally a comic strip from the 30s, and then there was a picture book series, and then eventually it was animated in the, I think the 80s and 90s.
Yeah. And there was a TV show as well, like from 80s, 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah, and it's sort of like it anthropomorphized Australian animals. Like one series was set in the bush, but another one I think they lost their home and they were traveling all over Australia trying to find their way back home.
Yeah, there was one that had a
and other animals.
Bushfire. I think one of the movies had a bushfire and they lost their home and trying to reunite with their family. And it was sad.
It was a bit similar to another series. I think it was a British series, The Animals of Farthing Wood. Did you guys see that one?
Yeah. Yeah,
it was sort of around the same time as that. It sort of reminded me. It was cuter than that, and not as hardcore as that show. But
by the way, there's also Fern Gully. The Lost Rainforest.
Hey! You just stole my point. Yeah. You stole my point. Fern Gully, all the way.
I've heard of that.
Fern Gully, like
still watch it occasionally. Fantastic.
I've actually heard of that one.
Tim Curry as the best bat ever.
Well, as a Rocky Horror fan, I know Tim Curry.
Sorry, the bat was Robin Williams.
Yep.
Tim Curry was the ooze.
The ooze had so much like charisma, and it was just like, you're such a bad villain, but there's something about you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't seen that movie since I was a kid. I should rewatch it. But the main movie for our family was The Castle, which is kind of a famous family comedy in Australia. And then when I was a teenager, I saw Mad Max and Romper Stomper, but it wasn't really till after high school that I started seeking out other Australian films. And a lot of the older ones are actually kind of hard to find, much harder than older American films, just because a lot of them weren't like converted to DVD or aren't widely available, which is kind of what the case was for my first pick. Like, it was Wake in Fright was considered a lost movie for a long time until it was discovered in some archive in America in the 2000s.
Yeah, and then the National Film and Sound Archive of Australia transferred it into digital. And guess what? It's on Stan as well if you're in Australia, so you can watch it there.
I think it's Madman Distribution.
Yeah, they do a lot of good stuff.
Yeah, because I knew them predominantly for years of watching anime, but they have a lot of older Australian films as well. I found I have my Cars at 8 Paris DVD, and that was 74, and that was on Mad Men as well. So they have some older Australian films. It just depends. You're just never going to see them in store. You pretty much have to exclusively order them online.
Yeah.
Have you guys seen the documentary Not Quite?
Oh, I love it. Nope. It's like the only time I can actually stand listening to Quentin Tarantino speak. And that's because he's talking about something awesome. Australian film.
That's kind of the thing that got me back into Australian films, like, because it was around sort of just when I was finishing high school, and it was like all these films I'd never heard of, and it puts forth the idea that they sort of call it the era of cinematic silence for Australia. So post World War II, right up until the end of the 60s, there was basically nothing coming out of Australia in terms of filmmaking. There was a few foreign directors coming and making Australian things, but really it wasn't until the government put together a film school and started funding film project, and because people had been held back for so long, there was just this huge explosion of filmmaking and creativity in the 70s and the 80s. And it was kind of divided into the art house films with Peter Weir and all those guys, and then the side of it that Not Quite Hollywood is interested in, which is all the exploitation films, like horror films and the action films and the sex comedies and all this crazy stuff that made its way all the way to America, where Quentin Tarantino would watch it in grindhouse theaters. But it's an awesome documentary.
And at the very end, and I think on their website as well, they list every single movie that they have referenced, which is really useful when you're trying to figure out what you want to watch when it comes to older Australian films, because they reference so many that some of them are flash in the pan, and then they just move on. SBS On Demand, for Australian listeners, has quite a few of them, actually. Like Patrick is on SBS On Demand, and quite a few other older ones.
But David, I'd be interested to hear, what is your impression of Australian cinema? Do many films from Australia get over to the States?
I mean, a few do, and half of them we're talking about today. But I mean, it's not just something that you even see. I mean, unless it's something huge, you know. I mean, yeah, you know, you've got your sci-fi classics and all that. You know, Mad Max made it here and whatever. I mean, which I never got into because it's a little more violent and less like idea driven than I like.
And Mad Max was dubbed.
No, was. I mean, if you were to ask me to think about like Australian movies that I know of, like I think probably Priscilla would be the only one, which we're going to talk about soon, is about the only one I can think of that I know off the top of my head besides Mad Max, you know, because as a gay guy, when I was like coming out, that came out like soon after, and I was in like a youth group and we all went to see it together, and that became like, you know, the campy thing that everyone saw and it was fun and whatever. And you know, and I mean, I just recently saw my choice, The Babadook, and you know, only because everyone was talking about it online and how good it was, and that's about it. Personally, you know, I mean, I don't even know what makes it here. I don't see a ton of movies. I'm more a TV person these days, so maybe I'm not the best person to ask.
But even in Australia, I don't think our movies in our own country make it massive, though. Australian movies only tend to be rather small. You'll get the few which blow up like Lion did and The Dressmaker, and that's because they have more international people working on them, or it was like a co-production tends to happen, and then they'll become super big. But
well, I think in the U.S. it's weird because I think there's very much an attitude of if it's not from America, it's either not very good or it's really smart and artsy, like particularly if it's from England. Like, you know, we'll get their TV and their movies sometimes on like PBS or on, you know, other stuff like that. And that's for like, you know, that's for the upscale crowd to watch. You know what I mean? It's like I think Australia has the opposite problem, or the opposite complex.
Right. There's this thing called cultural cringe, which is a supposed phenomenon that Australia and sort of post-colonial society suffer, where they consider their own cultural output or their own artists inferior to other countries like America and Britain. So they don't actually embrace a lot of their own until they become popular overseas. So, and you see that even with the Babadook. The Babadook received a pretty limited distribution in Australia when it came out. But once it got really popular in America, that's when Australians embraced it. which is kind of sad. Like there's this sense that Australians are like embarrassed of sort of embracing their own films, or embarrassed of hearing Australian accents on screen, or are worried how the rest of the world will see themselves. So it's sort of, Australian films often struggle in their own country.
Now, here's a question.
I know a reason for that. Sorry, just really quickly. The reason is Wog Boy, and that answers about all of it. Because that got a massive release. It was super hyped, and ever since then, Australian movies a little bit quieter. Just, maybe we shouldn't.
What was that guy's name?
Oh, I have no idea. Wait.
You mean the guy who starred in it? The comedian?
Yeah.
I will Google.
That would be Nick. Oh, nope. I am not from Melbourne, so cannot pronounce that.
Nick Geniopoulos. Yeah.
There we go.
I should know this.
Well, I was born in Melbourne, so.
Well, that's a Greek name.
I know.
Yeah. I actually
Wog
thought
Boy
maybe Fat Greek Wedding
Victorian.
was an Australian film because it was about Greek people. Go figure.
No, here, one question I have for you about Australian people.
Nick Giannopoulos.
What is your attitude towards like British movies and British TV? Like, do you, is that like as good as America, better, worse? Like, how do people, do you think about it?
It's
Given
different,
that, they're
but
the homeland.
British TV is like really popular here, to be honest. Like Downton Abbey was massive. Doctor Who's really, really big, especially when it first came back. Massive. And it was really big back when it was originally being run.
I think British TV is more popular than British movies. I'm trying to think of a few. I'm sure British movies were more popular in the past, but Australian box office these days is just so American saturated.
Well, I think most of the world is. 'Cause, I mean, even in Britain, there aren't a lot of big movies coming out of Britain where there's a lot of big TV shows. What's interesting here is that, like, when it comes to, like, British TV, is it's more of a niche thing here. It's like seen as like culturally better, smarter, like for the more upscale, not the masses. There's a few exceptions. Downton is huge. Doctor Who gets like a nerdier crowd, but not much past that. I think Sherlock gets a huge audience, and a few little things like that, but very few. I mean, Downton's probably the single biggest British import here. And that's about the only thing that gets like the kind of ratings that would match our own TV.
In Australia's case, and even to an extent, Britain, it's sort of harder for an industry to sustain itself on a population of like 20 million people.
Yeah.
Like American can be insulated because it's got within its own borders that can go and
over 300 million.
Pump these movies through money. Yeah.
I mean,
but Australia really has to, if it wants to be successful, it has to appeal to international markets. So there is a bit of a dilution of its own kind of identity.
On some of our like cable networks, there are shows that get under 1 million viewers, which is like 1/3% of the population of our country, and they do okay. Whereas if you did 1/3% of your population, they'd be out of business.
There's also the curse of, if an Australian filmmaker or performer or artist gets big enough, their destination is Hollywood. Like that's where the fame and the money is. So we can't really keep the most talented people within Australia. And there's plenty of like actors like Guy Pearce who will continue to come back to Australia and do Australian films and TV shows and all that. And that's awesome. But the mecca really is Hollywood for the best of the.
And you get that in Britain too. A lot of the actors.
Of course,
David Tennant left Doctor Who hoping to become a Hollywood star, and it didn't work out for him. And Matt Smith did, and he's actually doing pretty well right now. So.
It also might be because Australia is like England. We still have a massive focus on theatre. Hugo Weaving and Cate Blanchett, even though they're massive movie stars, there's still that kind of focus on theatre, I guess. And you get that in the UK, where America, unless you want to be on Broadway, fuck theatre because you want to be an actual star, that kind of thinking, where maybe Australia still has that, no, there's an art to it and we should develop that, and that is maybe why we do more artsy and thinking films, maybe.
One last question till we get into our main discussion. Are there any Australian directors or filmmakers whose careers you follow in particular?
Baz Luhrmann, because he's iconic and he doesn't make a massive amount of movies, so if you keep up with his career, it's a smaller number of things to keep track of, but when you do go and see it, it's going to be really, really good. Like really good.
What did you What did you think of Australia from 2008? Because that's the source of a lot of cultural cringe for a lot of Australians.
No, I haven't seen it in ages, but the thing is, it's Nicole Kidman and Hugh Jackman and David Wenham. How am I not going to like it? That's the bad part.
I actually enjoyed it when I went to see it in the cinema. I thought it was like a fun adventure, fun time. Like, I wasn't taking it too seriously, but I thought the big cattle herding and the battle scenes were fun.
Yes.
But everyone else hates it apparently.
Yeah, no, and I also really, really like Jeffrey Rush and Kate Blanchett, obviously. Okay. No, but with Jeffrey Rush, he has come back to Australia, and he did make Brand New Day, which is a film focusing on Aboriginals. It's really good, and it's a musical, and it's really, really good. And there's the Sapphires, and they both have Jessica Mauboy in them, and she sings in both of them.
Yeah, even though the sort of mainstream Australian industries become a bit stagnant, there's actually this big new wave of Indigenous Australian cinema, which doesn't necessarily get a lot of press. Like, they don't get a lot of money, but there's a lot of films coming out, particularly the Northern Territory, like Samson and Delilah and 10 Canoes and Brand New Day and
Rabbit
a new movie called Sweet Country that came out this year or last year, which is getting a lot of buzz.
There was the Rabbit Proof Fence in 2002 as well, which is a very, very good movie, but it's a hard to watch movie.
That's the thing. I think there's a perception for Indigenous films that they're going to be really intense and traumatic and sort of dig up all of this historical shame. So even though people might be able to watch, and Samson and Delilah is a bit like that, like, it's a beautiful, incredible movie, but it is like petrifyingly depressing at times.
Yep.
But not all the films are like that. Like Brand New Day and the Sapphires are like these fun sort of celebrations of Indigenous talent and culture. So they're not all like that.
Yeah.
There's also 10 Canoes, which is filmed entirely in Indigenous languages. I cannot remember what it was off the top of my head. And so, and it's beautiful, but I guess even that can be off-putting to people.
No, but as well with it, it's unfortunate because there isn't a common language with the Aboriginal tribes. They all have different languages or different dialects of it. So even if you do speak one, you won't necessarily be able to understand another one.
Yeah, I would say, unfortunate, just because it's kind of nice to still see all these differences, seeing that like 95% of them are now lost. So I think maybe film is a good way to preserve.
One person I'm sort of following is Brendan Cowell, who's a writer, actor. He's more involved with television. He wrote and starred in The Slap and Love My Way. Love My Way is probably my favourite Australian TV show ever made. But he also did a movie called Noise from 2007, which is a really great movie. And fun fact, he played a role in the most recent season of Game of Thrones. Yeah. He was one of the Ironborn. But I won't mention who because it's a bit of a spoiler.
Is there anyone, if you see them in a movie, like you see a movie and they're in it or like made it, that you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to go see it now?
See, I don't do that about anyone. If I go to see a movie or watch a show, it's because I'm interested in what it's about. I mean, if anything, I'd probably be more likely for a director, but I'm more into genre stuff, sci-fi, fantasy, whatever. And I want to see it doesn't matter to me at all who's in any movie I ever see or any TV show. I'm more interested in if there's a good writer I like or something like that. But I don't care about stars at all.
The closest for me for Australian actors lately would probably be Ben Mendelsohn. Like, he was in The Darkest Hour that just came out last year, and I was sort of on the fence about that, and then I saw he was in it, and I was like, oh, I'll give it a go. He's gonna play the king.
He's in everything now. I feel like I'm getting slapped with Ben Mendelsohn. We're watching something and there he is. It's good on him, because he's obviously put in the hard yards. But he's
a shapeshifter.
Yeah, I feel like in the past 18 months, it's just like Bam Mendelsohn.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't even know which movie it was, like that, where he sort of exploded into the frame. Because he was actually in The Dark Knight Rises, but I didn't even know he was Australian. I didn't know who he was.
And he was in Rogue One as well.
Yeah, but I think it was before Rogue One.
Because was it because he was doing the TV show Bloodline, and then people are like, oh yeah, It's really good.
Possibly. Oh no, it might have been Animal Kingdom. He sort of had a big role in that.
Yeah.
Anyway, we might move on. Did you have something you wanted to add, Dana, before we...
Silent era Australian films had a very similar output and quality to Hollywood era silent films, but they are now majority of them are lost. So, yeah, we actually had a film industry established before America did. Go figure. And World War One fucks everything.
Crushed it.
But it's still...
So this was pre-World War One. I think it was Australia, France, and America. They kind of dominated the silent era. And Australia actually, potentially has the claim to the first full-length feature film, which was called The Story of the Cali Gang.
Oh, of course it was.
Yeah.
And at that time, it was promoted as being the longest movie ever made at 40 minutes.
That's actually, for the time,
before that, movies
really long.
Yeah, before that, movies are only a few minutes long, but that was like the first... I mean, there's obviously movies before that, but that was the first full-length feature film.
The poor projectionist is like, there's 3 reels. What am I meant to do with 3? I'm used to 1.
I'm working overtime here. I think like 15 minutes of it has survived to this day, but yeah, most of it's gone. And they actually, that sort of brought about a bushranger craze, so there were all these bushranger films being made after The Story of the Cali Gang, but then the government banned it in 1912 because it was considered immoral and an affront to law and order.
Thing is,
And
that's
then
what
after World War
people
One,
wanted
kind
to
of collapsed.
see, and then, no, you can't watch it or make it.
It was also American distributors started buying all of the cinemas and only making deals for American films, so that also contributed to this kind of drying up of the industry. But let's talk about some films that were made. For our main discussion, each host will be presenting a movie to the group, and the movie I've selected is a 1971 psychological thriller directed by Dave Kotcheff called Wake in Fright. And Wake in Fright focuses on John Grant, played by British actor Gary Bond, a board teacher working at a school in the far western plains of New South Wales. On his way home to Sydney for Christmas, he stops overnight in Bundinyabba, a frontier mining town. The local policeman Jock Crawford, played by iconic Australian actor Chips Rafferty in his final film role, offers to show John around town, shouts him several rounds of beers, and introduces him to a lively 2-up game. Drunk, exhausted, and tempted by the chance of winning enough that he can escape his teaching contract, John ends up gambling and losing all of his money. The next morning, John wakes up with no means to afford a flight home or even another night's accommodation. He returns to the pub to drown his sorrows in more beer. Over the next few days, John is sucked into a hellish vortex of ritualistic drinking and fighting. He is plagued by the aggressive mateship of the locals, whom he now depends upon for food and board, and the relentless heat, dust, and endless space he now inhabits. Wake in Fright is a brutal assault on the Australian national identity. The untamed beauty of the rural Australian landscape is recast as a desolate wasteland which devours the minds and bodies of all who venture into it. The townsfolk are no longer the noble drovers and lovable larrikins of the land, but are suspicious, belligerent, and thuggish. And the film culminates in a hunting expedition in which the kangaroo, the star of countless children's programs and the country's coat of arms, is gunned down en masse. The film was not popular with Australian audiences, who were deeply uncomfortable with the way that Kotcheff, a foreign director, had painted them. Despite its lurid subject matter, the film is just as much an art film as an exploitation film, creating powerful and provocative images and developing complex ideas about the intersection of self, setting, and mythology. Its reconfiguration of the Australian landscape as uncanny and apocalyptic links it with the films of Peter Weir, who made Picnic at Hanging Rock. So, what did you guys think?
I hated it.
Have I thoroughly traumatized you by for making you watch these films?
I watched it with
You hated it, Sarah?
And then at the kangaroo hunting scene, she's like, "You look horrified," and I'm like, "I am horrified."
Yep.
Oh,
And
really? Oh,
I
gosh.
sent you
Sorry.
an angry message as well.
It is a horror movie,
But-
though.
After reading the controversy, I was expecting it to be worse, actually.
Oh, ditto, David, ditto. I was like, is this it?
I mean,
But
I guess
should
we're
say-
so spoiled by, Walking Dead and gore and whatever, except when you realize that this was real, that those scenes were filmed,
It
but
was
I don't know if we want to
real.
focus on that one scene.
Yeah, I get, it's, and there's so many times in it where I was like, they should not be shooting like that, what happens to aim and control? But that's also the whole idea of that scene, is this absolute loss of control.
Right. They're drunk, they're crazy, they're bestial, they're...
And in the credits, there's actually Nelson, the boxing kangaroo. So the big boomer apparently was fine. Don't know what happened to the little doe, but my family had a farm many years ago, and I have seen roo shooting, and it's nothing like that.
Right. They were freaked out and had to stop. In fact, there was a bit
exactly,
where he pretended that the cameras weren't working anymore, so they could because they had to stop or something like that. They had to trick them to stop doing it because everyone was freaking out. People were getting physically sick, and people worked up the show.
The hunt. But this wasn't part of the film. This was a hunting expedition that they filmed while the hunters were killing the kangaroos, and then they interfiled it with the footage of the actors.
Right.
So it wasn't part of the film shoot.
Right. If you didn't know that this was a real shooting, though, would you have been as disgusted by it? Was it the reality of it, or just the movie itself?
No, as in watching it, I'm like, I think that's actually real because I didn't do any reading up on it before I saw it. Right. And then I'm like, I think that's actually real. And Mum's like, it might just be that they got shots from professional hunting shooters and they used that. And I'm like, yeah, I don't care. I was horrified. And then at the end, when they left all of the top part of the kangaroos and only took the hindquarters, I'm like, why are they doing that? They killed so many. Yeah, and Mum's like, there's no meat on it, so there's no point in taking it. And I'm like, but still, so sad.
Right, yeah, I know, but that's the point of the movie.
Yeah,
like
how gross they were.
It's designed to evoke disgust and horror and waste and excess, and it's this release of carnal and toxic masculine rage at the world and inability to escape their fate and all that. So. I understand the emotion of disgust, but I don't think that's a mark against the movie.
Right. I mean, I think that's
it's not. It means I'm never going to see it again.
It means they succeeded in what it was trying to do. I mean, that's clearly, you weren't supposed to be like, oh, what a fun scene here. If you are, you're pretty twisted, I mean, I could see like maybe the Walking Dead crowd would be like, oh, that's nice and brutal. But I mean, I think most people, you're supposed to be utterly disgusted. And more to the point, you're supposed to ask yourself, is this what humanity can sink to? And I mean, that's the whole point of the movie, isn't it? Like the character John Grant he sinks to this and he's disgusted by it, and he's it's like any one of those movies about the deconstruction of humanity.
It actually reminds me a lot of Dorian Gray. Mm-hmm. Because it's that gradual sinking into it, and it starts with the gambling and then sex or lack of sex.
It's interesting to compare it to The Walking Dead or a war movie, because the imagery in that climax is definitely comparable in terms of its violence, but it's the fact that it doesn't start off, it doesn't necessarily set you up for that kind of experience. It's this very gradual process. It begins in a very normal frame of mind and gradually disintegrates.
Right.
And because of that, it is like Dorian Gray, or it is like Heart of Darkness.
Yeah.
Lord of the Flies, any of those.
Lord of the Flies, in the sense that it's this gothic experience. So it's the landscape becomes this hellscape, and the mind itself is disintegrating in the wake of it. But unlike, say, European Gothic, where it's all about enclosure and dark, tight corridors and being watched and all that, it's this sort of impossible, wide open space. It's this oppressive sun that kind of glares down. And there's a few sort of recurring shots of John looking up into this blinding light and having this kind of transcendent experience.
And the colors. And the colors in the filming. I mean, it's all orange and brown and desert and open, as opposed to...
But that's what it actually looks like.
Right. No, but I mean, it was filmed like the director talked about how he made sure there were no cool colors in it at all. It was all meant to be dark and builds that whole feeling of oppression and heat and and all that he's feeling. It's weird because I was watching this and I just remember thinking, what the hell is this movie and what is it about? Even when we're like halfway through it, and then of course we get to that scene and I'm really thinking that. But I mean, like all through it, I'm just like, where are we going? I had no clue where they were going with this movie.
It's a very sensory or sensual film. Like you can really feel like the texture, the grit of the dust and the sweat on their bodies. And there's a great scene where he sort of first enters the pub, and it's just packed with these like sort of human flesh, this glistening human flesh, bodies grinding up against sort of other half-naked men, and he's pushing himself through it, and you can feel the squelch and the shafts of light pouring through. And there's like, you get the kind of the seduction of the beer, because it's this cold,
the beer is like obsessive,
that quenches this inescapable heat. It's like the only respite, it's the only oasis in this desert. So that's why they keep chasing.
And I found it so weird how, like, we talk about some of the one things we mentioned before we were going to talk about is some of like the cultural weird things that I'm wondering if how much of that is from the movie, how much of that is from me being an American, how much of it is from this being in 1971 as opposed to today. But like a lot of little things, like you talked about, for instance, like being half naked in a bar. That's something like I wouldn't experience unless I was in a gay bar where that was the point. Like, I mean, the idea of like, of a not gay bar having like shirtless men, I don't experience that in America. I don't know if that's something that happens there or if that's just because it was so hot and before air conditioning, maybe. The all men in a bar, like apparently in that real world, women were only allowed in like on certain special days. Like that's not something you see in America. I thought that was really weird. And the chugging of the beer, like, I mean, just drinking the whole thing down in one sip, like almost every time, was just so like, that's not something I see very often unless you're like in a frat party.
Thing is, it's not just a bar, it's an RSL club, so it's a Return Servicemen's League. So it's not just a bar, which is why everyone stands and they for the ode.
Oh, before we start on the Anzac stuff, just like 2 steps back, when you were like talking about the movies that it reminds you of, and I don't know a lot about gender in films and that kind of thing, but this film was like, the films that you reference are about toxic masculinity, and this is the epitome of it in the 1970s, before we even really ever used terms like that, and how dangerous it is. And Doka, with I think the right term is like how, like the sensuousness of it, where you have the receptionist in the hotel and she's dipping her fingers in the water in front of the fan and rubbing it down her body, and it's just bizarre.
Thing is,
expecting that, I was like, he's still making eye contact with her. I would not be making eye contact with her. I would be looking away and blushing because she's obviously enjoying herself in ways that shouldn't be in public. And even then, they talk about sex a bit later on with the doctor, but it's bizarre.
It's like the heat and the isolation dissolves all of these kind of social norms that you would expect in the city or in civilization that he's obviously used to. But they're so beyond it that it's like they take away those borders. And it's interesting. Like, I think the early parts of the film, there's this real sense of tightness and repression with John. The fact that he denies the beer on the train and he's always buttoned up and he's always checking his watch. There's this ritual and this sense of order and this sense of everything working together like a machine. So when he's confronted with this intensity and this temptation of beer and gambling, it is like the unloosening of those repressions and him sort of giving himself over to this kind of primal sort of inner self. That's kind of like, it's not just a horror, it's also a desire. Like he's being not just repulsed but attracted to this.
Oh, and so much of it you see him enjoy it, and and that kind of stuff. And the scene where he wakes up and he's super hungover and it's so hot, and I felt for the poor guy. I was just, that looks like a 40-degree day, and to wake up in the middle of the day with a hangover.
Skulls a beer.
Yeah. There's no fix for that. There's just The
other thing that it reminded me of is this subgenre of American films called Hicksploitation, which is films like Deliverance and Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Hills Have Eyes, where the city folk kind of venture into the country or the rural landscape with this kind of nostalgic expectation of what they find, real America, rural America, or such and such, the frontier life. But what they find is this really unwelcoming, forbidding kind of backwards society. And it's very exploitative. It's obviously painting those kinds of people in a very unflattering light. But it's appealing to those kinds of urban paranoia about venturing out of the city, out of the ordered spaces of civilization.
But I think one of the things that I think is important to realize about this, though, is that I think one of the basic themes here is that as soon as he ends up out there, it takes him over too. So, I mean, one of the whole themes is that he thinks he's this cultured, better than them guy at the beginning, and he refuses the beers and you know, and all that. And then he falls into it too. And I mean, I think that's one of the whole themes is that, you know, we think of this as what the Hicks and whatever are, but this is us. Yeah. We can all be this if, you know, if we let ourselves. And he did. And, you know, I mean, I think this is, I think the, you know, the villain of this piece is not the locals, is not the people there. It's him sinking himself to it. You know, the director says that, like in a lot of his interviews, he talks about how he had a great respect for the locals when they went out to film it. And, you know, he talks about, you know, their culture and their camaraderie. And he talks about, you know, how he feels bad for them, but he also like respects their culture. Like, I mean, one thing I was really struck by was how, you know, everywhere he went, someone offered to buy him a beer. You know, that's not something you see very often in cities, I think. I mean, maybe I'm wrong on this, but like, I mean, everywhere he goes, and he even makes a comment about how, like, you know, how you know, you could do anything, but how dare I reject your beer? Like that's like I mean, you'd almost expect these like yokels, quote, you know, like the Hicks to not be that generous, but yet they were very kind, they were very generous, very inviting. They brought him right in. And you know, brought him into it.
That's why I think it's a better film than something like Deliverance, because Deliverance makes this very black and white dichotomy between the protagonist and this almost animalistic villain who's hunting them and all that. Whereas here, it's, you know, he actually lives amongst these people. He gets along with them. He becomes friends with them. He is ingratiated into them. And he's actually never like postured as this particularly nice guy. Like he's very condescending. He's very aloof. He's very rude to everyone. And they're all just offering him to buy him drinks. And maybe they're not as like cultivated as he is or whatever, but they're not necessarily bad people. So it sort of blurs that line, even though it's a horror film, it blurs the line in a lot more of a challenging way than something like Deliverance.
The horror isn't there.
He's a cultured Australian because he's like, yeah, I'm going to move to England. London's my place. I'm going to be a journalist. Yeah, we can tell you're a tosser.
Yeah, and it's interesting how he starts. I mean, if you
say this as an Australian that's lived in London. I'm sorry.
Particularly,
isn't he actually English though?
Yes, he is, and that's the thing I thought.
I don't think he's English. He is very much Australian. That is that is the 1950s and 60s education did. It was so Anglophilic,
or he is actually British.
We were so Anglophilic at that point that, yeah, the actor might be English, but he's not. He's playing an Australian, like, you know.
Yeah, Gary Bond is a British actor, but I think the character in the book is Australian. And as you say, Dana, the cultivated Australian accent was pretty similar to the British accent.
I was going to say,
we are meant to assume.
And I also thought it was interesting how he starts off the movie very pretty. If you notice, like, he's really made up. Like, if anything, they put like excessive makeup on him in the early parts of the movie when they filmed it.
And excessive body oil.
Like all around, like he's made up to be, you know, I just thought that was so odd that he's like made up to be so pretty in this like dirty area where he's about to be covered in dust everywhere, you know, and then that's clearly, you know, something they did on purpose, I think, at least, you know.
Jeffrey Rush is probably a good example of like the cultivated Australian accent.
Yeah.
Slightly affected. But it is a great image, like who he is at the beginning, this nice tidy suit and this nice tidy hair, and then by the end of it, he's like staggering down the main street with a rifle, looking like hell. But then the key bit is he tidies him. By the end of the film, he's tidied himself up again, and he's headed back into. Well, I guess it's still pretty far into the outback, but he's headed back to his old life. But he's had this experience, and now he's taking it back home with him.
And then as well, we know he's changed as a character through it because on the train back, he accepts the beer he's offered.
Right.
Right.
Oh, one other thing I was going to say about when we were talking about the locals, one of the things I thought was also interesting was how you have this gambling system, this game they played, right? And did you notice it was all honor system, which I thought was really interesting. You would expect that when you're thinking like dirty local yokels and whatever, that they'd be trying to steal from each other, whatever, but everyone was on honor.
Yeah. No, with it, 2-up is actually illegal now, except on Anzac Day as well. That's the background knowledge, so don't play it, at least in Australia.
Thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
No,
Sarah, with the RSL thing. I found it.
I had no idea what that was. That was weird to me.
No, as in actually it
thought,
looks exactly like RSL clubs, and that's quite a similar vibe to one. As in, I went and was in one like a year and a half ago, and exactly the same, apart from the fact they did not have a pokies machine because it was in Victoria.
That whole scene was just weird to me.
I thought it was only today, the past 10 or so years, that Australians have just been blindingly Anzac heavy.
No, it's been...
Which, don't get me wrong, I'm all for soldiers and that kind of thing, and I have family members that have been part of the RSL. It's good.
Can I
questioning loyalty.
Can I interrupt for a second and just ask that you define what you're talking about for those of us who aren't Australian? Because I think our listeners are going to have no idea what you're talking about. You're throwing initials around that most of us have no idea what you're talking about.
RSL is Returned Servicemen's League. So that means if you were in the Army, Navy, Air Force, you can go there and be part of the community there, and it's for that.
Anzac.
And post World War II, you had a lot of returned servicemen too, much larger ones. Anzac is Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, and it was the Anzac myth is the biggest myth that Australia tells itself over and over again. It is a big myth, and I mean big in size, not big myth as in no, they weren't heroic, they didn't go out there and try their hardest. I mean
bro, I'm gonna fight you if you said that. I would fight you.
But it's also unquestioned, which is my problem. It's you're not allowed to think critically about Anzacs because that will get you fired from SBS or ABC. It's not going, well, yes, we're glorifying those who fought for us, but they were cannon fodder because Churchill had a good idea. If you say something like that, that's been seen as not
non-kosher. But
it's
with this.
But it's unquestioning, and it was really interesting to see something in the 1970s in an RSL where you have people playing 2-up and gambling, and you have lines and lines of pokey machines.
And then you stop for this weird.
Yeah.
I thought the whole
disrespectful behavior in an RSL, but then you have to go through this whole minute silence thing because they turned the light on, and it's bizarre. But the thing is, weird.
It's paying respect for the fallen servicemen who gave their lives. That's
it's not the minute silence thing. It's not the minute silence thing. It's within the
everything
RSL.
Around it.
Yeah, it's such a juxtaposition. I'm all for having a minute silence.
Okay. And that's exactly what I saw as an outsider who has no idea what this even is. I just was like, wait a minute. We were just in the middle of drunken debauchery, gambling, drinking, boozing, and suddenly we all stop and salute a thing on the wall. That was just really weird to me.
And that's my problem with Anzac Day now is that instead of going to morning services, people or doing anything like that, doing something for your community, actually finding out where your local RSL is, maybe giving them a hand. People just get really excited, go to the CAS and play 2-up.
I just wanted to go back to what David was saying about the 2-up game and how no one thought of cheating. And I think it relates to something that I don't know what he is. He's just the lone policeman of the town, played by, it's Jock Crawford is his name, played by Chips Rafferty, and he says something to the effect of, no one commits crimes here because there's nowhere to run. So that idea that the town is so isolated that if you do anything wrong, you will be caught, either by the townsfolk, or the policeman if you're lucky. But he says it's more common, suicide is much more common because there's nowhere to run. They They basically try to escape by other means, which is what
right.
So which is what John contemplates at the end.
Right. And a little background note: the director said that apparently they do have a very high rate of suicide there, but interestingly, particularly among women. So just a little background.
Yeah, the lone female character was pretty sad, the way she was treated and the way she exhibited herself. That was kind of depressing.
Yeah. I mean, this is not
completely shut down, and
it's not a movie about women. I mean, let's be honest, it's about the whole male situation there. Although I think you could have had an interesting side story about how the women survive there, because apparently it's about 3-to-1 men to women. So it does make sense that she'd be sleeping around like that, but
it's an articulation of the chauvinism and the misogyny of these characters, that the larrikin figure is not this lovable oaf, as he's actually this deeply objectifying and sort of toxic force to the people around him. Either he's fighting them or he's harassing them.
Right.
But interestingly, the actor who plays the policeman is Chips Rafferty, who's like this famous kind of 1950s Australian actor.
And that was his one
song. He's in this movie called this is his final film, and he's sort of seen as like the quintessential kind of lovable, Aussie battler. He was in this film called The Sundowners, which is this kind of sweeping Australian epic about a cattle drive, similar to Australia, I guess, the film Australia. But whereas here, his persona is completely flipped on its head, and rather than being this lovable bloke, he becomes this almost this fascist kind of omnipotent figure who's constantly watching everything, pressuring John into drinking more and sort of bullying him and sort of seducing him into this kind of dark world, which I thought was a really interesting subversion, to use that persona and then flip it on its head. The same thing they do with the kangaroo.
Right. And you know what, he apparently the directors talked about how he really sucked down that beer. And apparently they were using real beer, and then for a while they tried to use non-alcoholic beer, and he freaked out, what are you giving me? What's this crap? I can't act with this. So they had to give him real beer, and they said that in one shoot he had something like 16 pints of beer. And they were like, I don't know how he delivered his lines, but he did. So
David, the reason why people neck beers like that is back in the day, you saw it. They're the bar closes at 6:30. I forget what they call it. It was the 4 o'clock skull or something like that. So you essentially finished work, had to neck 3 pints and then go home. And you had lockout, so it meant that the bar was technically closed. So no new people could come in. You weren't meant to really serve beer. People were just meant to be finish their drinks and leave or something like that.
And then they go back and play 2 up.
So this is right after that. Yeah, well, this is right after those laws ended. So, they still kind of have similar ones on the books. But that's why people could neck beards. But it's also much easier to neck a middy than it is a pint, which is what people do these days. I'm all for going back to middies.
There was a couple of things I just in terms of, we haven't really talked at all about the end, where he first tries to shoot Doc or thinks about it, and then tries to kill himself. It's interesting. He goes out and he kills kangaroos, and that's all okay, right? And all that craziness he lives through. But then he comes home and Doc rapes him. It's interesting because it's not clear. It doesn't seem that from the movie, but the director has himself called it both rape and sexual assault in other interviews. And that's when he freaks out and leaves. And then he comes back to try to get him.
I don't think
I didn't read it that way.
All.
I didn't either.
I thought it was more he realized what he had done with shooting all the kangaroos, and then was just like, oh my God, and then tried to leave, and then wound up back in the town.
But
I definitely read it as a I definitely read it as a sexual encounter between him and Doc, but I didn't interpret it as rape, just because the final scene is them looking in longingly into each other's eyes as they're on top of each other, and then it cuts to morning.
Right,
but
and see, that's where
I don't know.
That's where I wonder if that's us looking at it from a modern viewpoint, because I mean, again, I've read there's one story that the director tells over and over and over again, and that's of some famous director who was sitting behind him in his screening of it at Sundance and going, oh no, he goes there. And every time he tells this story, he calls it a scene of sexual assault and rape. So that's that was something I found interesting, because I agree with you, Duncan. I saw that as like a consensual thing, like their masculinity brought them together for this moment, and which I still felt weird about, but like that, I think that's our modern sense looking at it, because he meant it as rape. And oh god, I can't remember.
I mean, you could argue that he was so intoxicated that he couldn't consent, but it seems like they're both equally intoxicated, right. So it was a kind of a joint bad decision. But I don't know. Yeah,
I read it as just like a clumsy pass was probably made, and they fell asleep drunk near each other. But
he's got his pants off.
Yeah,
he's naked,
right.
Like,
so. He's naked after. And by the way, it's Scorsese. Scorsese was sitting behind him in a screening, and he's told this story multiple times. And in fact, that was kind of the moment that made Scorsese go, "Oh, this is such a great movie! Oh my God, he went there! He did it! Oh my God!" And he freaked out about it. And that's one of the reasons why, when Scorsese ended up in charge of Sundance, that he brought it back to be shown as one of the classics. And in fact, it's one of only 2 films that has ever been shown at Sundance twice. But I remember thinking, for a 71 movie, like, did they really go there in 1971? Really? I was actually surprised by it. And then to hear him call it rape was just a little weird to me.
Yeah, I mean, the director has his opinion, but based on the film grammar, that wasn't communicated to me.
But then he goes back and tries to shoot him, and is it because he led him into this dark world, or if you believe it is rape, is that more of what it took? Is it a weird 70s view of like, gee, if you've raped me or you have gay sex, that's even worse than like the brutality we did to the Roos? We can show brutally assaulting kangaroos, but we can't show like a gay kiss.
It seemed like Doc had become the embodiment of all that he thought was evil in this town, because all of the other characters were very sort of animalistic, whereas Doc spoke with this very high-minded and intelligent observation. Even though he still indulged in all of the same vices, he had this kind of lofty perspective of it, which seemed to imply that he was, if you sort of read it as this kind of hell allegory. I think he's the first character that says, all the little devils so proud of hell.
Right.
You could see him as the kind of head devil. So he sees him as the architect of all his anguish. But the fact that he then turns the gun on himself, to me, suggests that if there was a sexual engagement, he was sickened by it, but he didn't necessarily blame Doc. He just wanted to, I don't know, expunge his experience or end his anguish or something.
And in many ways, Doc is him.
It's ambiguous.
And in many ways, Doc is what he's afraid of becoming, because Doc is the guy who succumbed to this permanently, and Doc was him, 5, 10, who knows how many years ago, and now he's here and he's fallen into the same quagmire that Doc has, and he manages to pull himself out of it, although by trying to kill himself. Well, first Doc, then himself. So
that's a good point, and it sort of bodes well with the kind of gothic trope of the doppelganger. Like, he sees himself in the future and he wants to avert that somehow by killing it or cutting himself off in the past or something.
Because Doc is still doing poetry. In fact, he talks poetry to him after he's knocked out, after he's passed out.
He's the sort of the paradox of the civilized and savage man in one. Yeah.
Which is, in fact, John Grant.
With it, yes, I don't like it, but I think what Mum said about it is very true, and that it is very much of the era and it's very much of country Australia, so it has its place.
Well, let's move on to something lighter, but still with some dark themes. And I think there's some interesting common shared themes between the two films. So Dana, would you like to tell us about your movie?
A desert holiday, let's pack the drag away. You take the lunch and tea, I'll take the ecstasy. Fuck off, you silly queer, I'm getting out of here. A desert holiday, hip, 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 hooray. I chose The Adventures of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, because 1994 was wonderful. It was written and directed by Stephen Elliott and costumed by Tim Chappell, and he won the Academy Award for Best Costume Design with Lizzie Gardner. Released 10th of August 94, and like a month later in Australia, because even Australian movies don't have the same release date as they do in the US, because life sucks. Just to give you a quick background about 1994 in Australia, our Prime Minister was Paul Keating. The West Coast Eagles had defeated Geelong in the AFL.
So Donna should be happy if she goes for West Coast.
Oh, no, that's not my
Are you
thing.
a Dockers fan?
It's not my thing. I abstain from the Australian delusion. Christopher Skase had been arrested in Spain and nothing came of it. And a month later, June wins the Melbourne Cup. And the last bit is the Human Rights Sexual Conduct Bill for legalising sexual activity between adults in private had been passed. So that's Australia in 1994.
Ahead of us, by the way, in the US. So.
Side note, have any of you guys seen the best of Paul Keating insults in Parliament?
Oh no, but I now must.
To?
Because he was very
so
witty. He was too smart to be a politician. That was his problem. Tick accepts a job to perform at a casino in Alice Springs. He's joined by Bernadette, a trans woman who's recently lost her 25-year-old partner when he slipped in the bathroom while dyeing his hair. And Adam, a flamboyant, always-on performer. They are joined by Bob, an outback mechanic, and a bus named Priscilla, which was paid for by Adam manipulating his mother. Anyway, along the way, they see the beauty and horrors of Australia and a few twists along the way. That being Tick was married, Tick being great friends with his wife, and that his wife is lesbian. And they have a son, although this is hinted at the beginning, but when I first watched it, I did not pick up on that at all. But I think I was about 10. It is a wonderful film. It is one of my... it is my favorite Australian film. It is one of the prettiest things that you will ever see, that because drag is such a city art and culture, if that makes sense. You won't... I don't think drag would ever pop up randomly in a country town. It might. Apparently Northern Territory has a massive drag scene, but that might be because they went to Alice Springs. So it's just this really artificial beauty with the natural beauty of Australia and all this other stuff that comes up, like aging in relationships and family and homophobia, masculinity. And what did everyone think of it?
It was great, as always. It's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean...
Yep, I loved it. It was great.
It's fun. I mean, it's absolutely fun. It's campy. It's silly, but it's also touching. It hits real issues, real emotions. You know, it's surprisingly deep for such a, what seems like a silly, flamboyant movie. I mean, I remember watching this back when it first came out, and I was not a little kid. I was out, and everyone. I mean, I went with like a gay youth group to see it, and we were or LGBT, but back then we just say gay. And everyone was just like, "This is fabulous," Funny side note, the second time I saw it was a couple of years later at an LGBT Pride Week celebration. They had it outdoors on Boston Common, and it was shown for anyone. And because of that, they had to cut out anything remotely controversial, which presumably would be most of the movie. But I mean, so all the best scenes were completely cut out, which sucked, including the amazing ping pong ball scene.
Segues me to my next point, because that's one of the big criticisms about it, and quite a few people attached to the film have said essentially, well, she's not meant to portray every Filipino woman in the same way that 3 drag performers from Sydney are not meant to portray every single man in Australia.
But
in a film about breaking down stereotypes, it was a particularly ugly stereotype.
Right.
Yeah.
But yet it is hysterical.
Musical, and you can buy pink ping pong balls. And on that, the Conversation Hour, the ABC Melbourne version, had an interview with Tim Chappell, and I'll quote him directly. When they brought up the ping pong balls, and he said, quote, "It was never culturally appropriate ever at any time in neither the film or the musical, and that's why it must stay, because there is something in Priscilla to offend everybody. We made sure of it." which
I
I really like.
It is offensive. It's one of those scenes, it's like ridiculously offensive, but it's probably the most memorable scene in the movie. As awful as it is, it's like you feel guilty laughing, but you have to laugh. Like,
it's hard not to, yeah.
I think this movie is the most diverse out of all of the movies, though, that we've chosen. All of the movies are very, very white, like incredibly white.
Right.
It's because Priscilla has the scene with the Aboriginals.
Right.
With their corroboree, and that's the only reason why it's not incredibly white, and it's still really white. But yeah.
I really like that scene because it's like the best reception they get out of all the performances they give throughout.
Right.
Like they try a few pubs and they get pretty lackluster reception. Even the final performance they give, the whole point of the journey to this hotel that Tick's wife is managing, it's just this very tepid kind of applause.
Right.
But when they're with the Indigenous people, it's like this massive celebration. Everyone's dancing, everyone's joining in. Their savior runs in and gets dressed up and is performing. So it's like these two kind of marginalized groups who have found each other out in the middle of nowhere. That's actually where the most life and the most performance and the most love kind of flourishes.
Because they appreciate it. They appreciate understanding, being different, and I liked it.
I also love the relationship between Tick and Bernadette.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it's a very silly and irreverent kind of script a lot of the time, they're making fun of everything and all that. But that relationship I thought was really deep, and the conversations they were having, and the history, like where Tick reveals that he was married in a past life, that he gets really choked up and says, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you, but I'm not sorry you came." Like there's a really moving performance in those two leads, I thought, and there's a lot of real human emotion and history embedded into this performance.
Right. Well, you get all his guilt from, his guilt of having done this and not talking about it, and
And they're sort of an older generation of drag queens, and they're sort of taking this other guy under their wing and kind of fostering him, trying to teach him how the world works and toughen him up. So I really like that dichotomy of the different generation.
Because one of the points that I put down was like this idea of community, and you see it from the very beginning when Priscilla embarks versus that coast to coast run. Like Priscilla is just three drag queens in a bus, and she gets a full send off, and this woman who's running coast to coast with a weird thing on her back, it's like two people.
What was that?
And it's all very staged.
That was so weird.
I forgot that was from the beginning of the movie. I was like, "Where is what?"
Yeah.
Every time I saw her again, I was
until
like,
she like runs past them. Yeah, it's
so
twice.
good. But I also love that she did keep coming back occasionally.
Right.
So, like you did see her, and then every time they're like, "Hello," and she's like, "I don't care who you are. I'm busy." With Bernadette, I loved their relationship, and it definitely stemmed because they both have been in the industry for a very long time and have known each other for a very long time, so you can see that trust between them.
Right. Well, I think you get that, I mean, I'm not a queen in any sense, but I think that when you've got an older generation of gay men who've lived through a lot together, there's a sort of sisterhood, like my best friend, Michael, we call each other sisters, and we mean that because we feel like sisters. And I think that that's what you got with them because they've been through a lot. I mean, look, when she says, I've learned how to fight because I've had to. That's an important bit. I mean, it's interesting because the youngest character gets, in many ways, the least of a story, except they do get one of the most important ones, which is the bashing scene, which, shows the foolishness and, and the frivolity, but also the real danger in their lives from day to day. That was one of the things that I'm glad that
but
scene
with that scene as well, it's the intergenerational thing, because Tick and Bernadette's generation had set up a community that meant that Adam's generation never had to see that or feel that way or be made to learn how to fight.
But to be honest, in 1994, she would have. I'm sorry, in 1994, you could get beaten up walking down the street. Even in Sydney or Boston or even New York, and frankly, even today, that's still a danger out there, and it's something that particularly trans people have to deal with, and you can argue if any of these three characters are truly trans, because, certainly the other two don't seem it as much, But
Bernadette is trans though,
right.
because they say she's taking hormones.
Exactly. The other two are drag queens, and there is sort of that whole difference too, and that's in fact a debate in LGBT community over whether drag is real trans or if it makes fun of women or trans people or if it's bad. And I don't want to get into that because that's long and complicated. But I mean, there is, whether you're trans or just doing drag, there's a danger every time you step out of the house. You could not make it home again. And, that's something that my generation of gay men had to live through as well. Not as much as the trans people, though, because it's on your face, quite literally with the makeup and everything else. But, we can sometimes hide, although some of us can't. And I think that's something that this generation, when you talk about this, I mean, you would think that she would have understood the danger that she was putting herself into, or he, whichever, in this scene. But yet, there is the foolishness, and you add alcohol and all that. And I'm glad that scene was in there.
I think we are meant to think that Adam has lived a more sheltered experience.
Right. Yeah,
he's been kind of a part of Sydney where he hasn't been exposed to this. I mean, Sydney, yes, definitely that stuff would happen, but
they
contrast
say
with these very small outback towns, it's going to be much more severe.
In the movie,
and I think that.
No, in the movie they actually say, I think it's Anthony says that in a way Sydney's protected them. So as much as it's kept them in, but it's also kept other things out. So yeah,
that's what I was going to say. And I think that adds the kind of importance of this expedition. Initially, it was just about this fun romp. They were going to get away from their lives. They were going to go up and do this show, get their heads right. But the fact that they're having to confront these really backwards and these really hostile attitudes that are still out there, it's more about like leaving the kind of safety of places like this city and saying, no, we're actually here. Right. We're part of this world. We're going to show that we exist. We're not invisible. Right. We can't be, shunted aside. And I think the visual, the visual kind of grammar of the movie is so powerful. Right. The colors of the sprawling red landscape and just the multicolored
costumes,
costumes against, speeding against that or up on a rock and all that. It's so it's so like mesmerizing and beautiful, especially compared to like the way that the pubs are kind of shot are very dank and dark and shadowy and dull and boring. And when that color is added, it just adds so much life. So it's kind of adding this, it's the idea of this spectrum, that this whole spectrum to humanity, but also about saying, we're here, we're not going to be afraid, and you're just going to have to accept this.
And in comes someone wearing a dress made out of thongs, which was fabulous. I mean, a dress full of bright, colorful thongs is just, or flip-flops, a lot of people in America would call them, is just hysterical.
I mean, this had to win the Oscar for best costume.
Right, absolutely.
At the Oscar.
It was actually up against two period pieces, so when I looked at it, I was like, that they could have gone the conservative route, because that kind of brings me on to one thing I had to ask you all, but I'm going to go first, which was your favorite costume, because I'm just going to say mine first so no one else gets in. Okay. Mine was definitely the Guy Pearce in the silver costume, lip-syncing to La Traviata, the opera, on the bass and the silver. And the makeup and everything.
Yes.
I was worried for him. I thought it was going to, rip him off this. There was too much costume that the wind was going to rip him into the sky.
You need to listen to the History Hour, not History Hour, that's BBC, the Conversation Hour, because they talk about that, because the day that they filmed it, there was absolutely no wind, and it got to the point where they had to film it.
Fake it.
And Tim Chappelle, because the stunt coordinators, the length of the train, they said you need to cut this down significantally because it's long enough where it's going to get caught in the wheels and we might accidentally kill Guy Pearce. You need to snip it. And he was about to take his scissors to it, and the wind picked up, and they're like, we can film. So it was a miracle. If there's a God, thank you. That wind was well deserved.
In the montage, I love the lizard costumes, and the makeup they have for it, I think is incredible. Mm-hmm. So that's my favorite.
I think the thong dress was trashy fun, but I think if I had to pick a favorite, the 3 matching ostrich outfits when they're wearing the ostrich heads. Yeah, or emus. Yeah, when they're wearing them on their heads and they're wearing like the dress is the body of it. That was fabulous. That was in that montage at the end as well with the lizards.
What were the other animals they dressed as?
Wasn't there some catty kind of thing?
They did a gumnut baby.
Lion.
They had like the little golden wattle outfit. They had the Sydney Opera House,
which was cool.
Oh yeah,
that was epic.
They had the like 70s, like
the really
halter
flared
top
ones.
one. Yeah, the really flared ones where like their shoes were part of the outfit. Their feet were inside of it.
Yeah, see, that's enough. Everyone needs to listen to the conversation now and just like this episode because he talks about that because they lost funding twice. So his background was during his Bachelor of Arts in fashion design. He was making costumes for drag queens on the side. And as he says, it was mock de croc. So it was, something for very little money. So that's why things like the thong dress existed.
Right.
That
cost her like $10 or something. Right. It was cheap. I remember. Yeah.
Yeah.
But like that halter neck one, because they lost funding twice, it meant that he had so much time to gestate on these costumes. So originally it was going to be like an afro and a halter top and some flares. And then he was like, then I put a flower behind their hair. And then there was tons of flowers. And I'm like, why don't I do an afro full of flowers? And then they originally had shoes, but I wanted them really flared. So then I kind of attached it to the shoes. And then I realized they didn't need shoes at all. So it was kind of the nice thing about people bailing on that film so many times is that these costumes are fantastic.
If that's probably going to be one of the things that most people will take from it was just the fabulous outfits. I will say one of the things that I also thought was interesting is that, this movie was made in 1994, right in the middle of the AIDS epidemic. The year before the antiretroviral cocktail that ended up slowing down the deaths massively. And most movies in this era, at least LGBT-themed ones, have to talk about HIV/AIDS because, it just was so overwhelming in life. It was just everywhere. And it's interesting that the movie starts with a death, like so many of these movies, but it was actually that the lover fell in a bathtub, which I thought was an interesting. We didn't want to make it an AIDS death, but it was.
With this as well, though, in Australia, the AIDS epidemic was nowhere near as prevalent as in America. In Australia, it wasn't as bad, thankfully, because people got on top of it quite early when it got here.
Yes, but it was still...
It's still
incredibly
horrific.
devastating. But it did devastate, like, the Sydney and Melbourne gay community, and it was only because of grassroots organisations. Right. There was a Sydney Free Clinic that really... They were in, like, the late 80s, and that's what you see in Adam's bag. He has a thing of condoms, like... Because they were just like, you wrap it. And this was the late 80s.
You couldn't go to a bar.
In the mid-80s, we got needle exchanges, 85 blood donation screens. But the really interesting thing is, like, the AIDS fuckers go home when they painted that on the bus.
Right. That would have happened.
So I think Duncan has mentioned before the Grim Reaper ad, the bowling ad.
Yeah.
So that came out in 1987, and I was reading an interview with one of the women that was attached to it, and she said the good thing is it stopped a lot of high-risk behavior, but the other problem is that the straight community, they actually saw not the Grim Reaper as the AIDS virus, it was an AIDS virus at the time, like HIV now, they saw that as gay people, so it unfortunately put this stigma on the gay community that they weren't prepared for.
Well, I think one of the things you learned from that era was that anything you did would backfire because if people wanted to be bigoted and see bad messages, they were going to. There was, after, all the visibility of the AIDS activist movement and just the people dying and everything but all that, there was a huge backlash in America. There was a wave of bashing that happened after it. So, there was nothing you could do to help people that didn't have a backlash. And that's in many ways true of almost any civil rights movement throughout history. As people move forward, there's always a blowback, unfortunately.
One connection that I found to Wake in Fright was that the town where this happens, where they get the graffiti on the bus, is Broken Hill, which is where they shot Wake in Fright. It's the same town. Which I thought was interesting because Wake in Fright is all about this kind of toxic masculinity that the protagonist gets sucked into. And then in this film, it's sort of about actually going out into these places and confronting it from the other side. And it's this condemnation of this kind of attitude or behavior, that it is toxic and it leads to stagnation and fear, and that their journey is kind of making people, even though it seems funny and silly, making people laugh is actually kind of the best antidote, and making them see you as a real person is the best antidote to these kinds of attitudes.
Yeah, and I can tell you, you know, in the middle of the AIDS crisis, for all the awful horrors that people saw, we laughed a lot. You know, I mean, you know, we as activists, we went out clubbing and dancing and partying hard and having lots of sex and laughing and telling jokes and dark humor. There was a lot of dark humor, but you know, you have to laugh. That's the only way. That's how you deal with horror, I think, you know?
And to me, it's a nice antidote to Wake in Fright, because Wake in Fright is like this world of entrapment, and Priscilla is all about like breaking out of these shackles and creating a new world. And it's this journey is like this journey into the heart of, you know, what is Australia? What's actually out there? What's actually beyond the sort of safety of the city? And it's hopeful because it's like, Australia, it's not just this frozen kind of conservative nostalgia, or it's not just this Wake in Fright kind of haunted, empty, evil place, but it is capable of transformation. We're not this static thing, that we can actually change and evolve and like meet each other out in the wilderness.
As long as there's ping pong balls.
Bob. I just, like everything you said, I completely agree with.
Enough sequence can save anyone.
There you go. That if there's any message to take from this whole podcast.
And Bill Hunter, the Ocker male, opening up and finding himself. That's another hopeful little aspect to this movie.
Well, he even mentions like very quickly, like he saw Les Girls when he was in Sydney as a young guy. And that was between 1963 and like 1975, I think it closed down. Right. So he kind of has that, if it's gruff and horrible on the outside, or just, you know, rough and not inviting, but maybe deep down, you know, they just all gooey insides that just want to love someone.
He's so sweet. Like, he just loves it. Like, he's just so into it, like so unabashedly into the dancing and everything.
And he can deal with Adam so well. And it's just that, you know, he can, and he definitely sees the distinction between like Adam as a drag performer and flamboyant, and Bernadette as a trans woman, because every time I watch this film I get a little bit more, and especially the past, you know, 5 years, a lot has been said about trans rights, and that's fantastic. But this movie shows this tiny little thing within the gay community wasn't always good at dealing with trans people. It didn't understand it. It's gender versus sexuality, which is why, you know, it's really weird that they're lumped together.
Right.
When I watched it this time, the whole, you know, queer parents and the wonderful children that they'll have, you know, this fear that they'll raise, these little horrors of, and yes, there was like the one very heavy-handed part that like, like a lesbian mom can raise the most delightful boy. But come on, it was 1994 and gay boys hadn't been invented yet. Well, he hadn't got one yet. So let's see how nice he would be in like a year with Pokemon cards as well. Just added. But I did like it. I did like the parenting angle and about aging and all that kind of stuff, and him trying to schlock his drag Avon.
I know. Well, that's the thing. You know, you go into this movie expecting it to be silly and campy, and then you deal with issues that you wouldn't expect to see, like aging, like, you know, like parenting, like, you know, all these deeper issues that you wouldn't have expected from this kind of a movie, you know, which is what helps it rise above that kind of movie.
But can anyone else think of a movie that makes a joke about child molestation by the person that was molested?
Right? Yeah.
No. Only in this.
Right.
But it was just like, and it was like his mum was playing golf, so he was like stuck in the bath for 7 hours. And he was like, and I thought they were small and wrinkly before.
Yeah, that whole scene is so uncomfortably bizarre to watch, because it's like you want to laugh, but you want to be like, this is so inappropriate, and you want to be like, this is awful, but it's funny, but it's, I don't know what to think here.
No, I love the revenge that his mum was out, so the guy was left there for 7 hours, and it's just like, yeah, you should be left there for 7 hours and longer, and go to jail, please. So,
Right.
I have a question. Do Sydney ciders actually sound like that in the 90s? Because I swear, all of the movies set in Sydney at that time are super nasally. Like, have really nasally Australian accents, but Priscilla seems to be worse than usual. But
I don't know.
With Adam, it is an affectation that he uses.
it's part of his character, yeah. But like, it's super nasally, and I'm like,
Guy Pearce is amazing in this movie.
oh,
He's
Guy
like-
Pearce is amazing in everything. Let's be honest.
He just completely becomes that character.
Yep.
And he
called
was
acting.
cast at the 11th hour. And, you know, Terrence Stamp and Hugo Weaving had time to prepare. And, yes, they're a little bit older, so they're not as fluid with the dance moves. But you just see Guy Pearce, you're like, you were born into this. Like, how? You were cast weeks before they started shooting.
He's never still. He's always moving.
I know,
Every second
Yeah.
of the day.
Every time, I was just like, someone needs to give him some Ritalin. Just to see, because it's so ADHD, and it's just always moving, always moving.
Whenever he stops, it's like the most outrageous pose. Like every
course.
limb is contorted to the nth degree.
Well, I mean, it's someone not trying to take on society's airs of respectability. You know, I'll just do whatever I want. I'm going to move how I feel. And if you don't like it, fuck you. You were mentioning the dancing, which did make me bring up, if I had one criticism from this, it would be that whenever, like, all three of them were doing a performance, it felt like the background dancing was very flat, in the sense that I felt like they were very much doing 1, 2, 3, 4 in their heads. Like it wasn't smooth and natural. It was like, I have learned this routine and I'm doing step 3 now. You know what I mean? And that I thought was a little odd, because if anything, you know, drag queens are all about realness and, you know, making it seem natural and real. And I would have a hard time imagining these like forced dance routines that they did that were very like static, if I had any criticism of it. And that would probably be about it.
Oh, I just wanted to mention one last thing about, because it's 2018 now, and Stephen Elliott's movie Suburban Safari is out, and in a couple of months, Priscilla is coming to, like, the musical's coming back to Australia, but not to Perth, but to Australia. So Duncan, Melbourne, photos, please. I'll buy you tickets.
All right.
I need me
All
those
right.
ping pong
If you
balls.
buy me tickets, I'll go.
Yes.
I'll bring a packet of ping pong balls, to throw on.
That would be awesome. Audience
Well, yeah, 'cause-
participation, like car, you know.
I said throw.
Yeah.
That's proper Vok right
On
there.
that note, Sarah, would you like to tell us about your film?
Okay, so another Sydney cider dancing movie. I chose Strictly Ballroom. So this is a movie from 1992, and it is an underdog story of how Scott, an open amateur ballroom dancer, wants to go against the ballroom dancing establishment and dance his own non-federation steps in competition. He teams up with Fran, a beginner ballroom dancer with only 2 years of experience, to dance in the Pan-Pacific Grand Prix Dancing Championship. This is an underdog story about beating the establishment and corruption. It is very much a story about going out there and doing things you want to do and being the person you want to be. Comedy, romance, drama, this film has it all. And it's Baz Luhrmann's feature film debut. It is a foot tapper that you have to go see, and it's guaranteed to put a smile on your face. And this one actually won 8 out of the 13 Australian Film Institute awards that it was nominated for. And it won the Cannes Film Festival Award of the Youth for Foreign Film. And it won 3 of the 8 BAFTAs it was nominated for. And it was also nominated for the Best Motion Picture, Musical or Comedy at the Golden Globes. So it has a great pedigree.
And it put Baz Luhrmann on the map.
It really did, as in it was this movie, Romeo and Juliet, and Moulin Rouge. That's what's known as his Red Curtain trilogy. And it was Moulin Rouge is the one that they won the Oscar for costuming for.
So Australia was obviously in like a dancing fever in the early 90s. It seemed like.
It must have been. But then again, I think everything was set in Sydney in the early 90s, I'm pretty sure too.
Yeah, Melbourne didn't exist in the early 90s.
Nope.
But it sort of is of a piece with Priscilla in more than just dancing, because it is kind of the idea of tradition and challenging tradition and outsiders and almost sort of creating this new language to define who you are. Like you can't, especially for the I've forgotten the character's name, the female lead.
Fran.
But, Fran. She's very much like a wallflower and can't really express herself except through dance, and that's kind of how she comes out of her shell, or that's how she blooms.
Yeah.
So that idea of not being able to speak yourself, but being able to express yourself through movement and music and transform that way in costume, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
the ugly duckling story.
It's not the most ridiculous transformation. Like, she's all that. You're like,
no,
she's plain, but she's pretty, but she's still pretty plain. Like, it's nice.
Right.
Also, thank you for choosing this film, because I've never seen it. I've also never seen
I've never seen it either.
Because I don't know how.
What?
What?
I'll fix it. It's fine.
wait, what, have you never seen The Castle?
Yeah.
I haven't seen it either. We can,
I don't even know what it is.
Oh my god.
Hey, I said it earlier that I hadn't seen it in the chat, okay? You obviously didn't read it then.
You are a monster.
I don't even know what it is, so.
It's
What am I
a
doing
massive movie, like cult. As in, like, I always hear my parents talking about it or referencing it, and I'm like, yeah, I need to watch it. I'm going to watch it.
I think it's a film that only Australians would find funny. I don't think it would work for Americans because it's so like specific and silly in the way in the jokes. But it's like, yeah, that's probably my favorite, if not one of my favorite Australian films. But if we do another roundtable, we can do that definitely, because you got to watch it.
It's the Faulty Towers of Australia. Like, it's referenced in the same way, I feel.
It's Mabo, it's justice, it's the vibe. It's just the vibe.
But also how, like, Baz Luhrmann-esque, like, not all of his shots, but when they're dancing around the Hills Hoist in front of that massive coke ad, I'm like, that is Moulin Rouge. Like, that shot is used in Moulin Rouge. Yep. And it's really nice to see that kind of stuff. I really enjoyed it, and I totally get why middle-aged women get all hot under the collar for him now. But, like, Strictly Come Dancing. Yeah. Dancing with the Stars. I was like, oh, he is still on that, like,
I actually...
No, but in this movie...
from the 80s.
I have a weird story.
Yeah?
I didn't realize it, or I didn't put the pieces together till I watched this movie again, but I had Paul Mercurio as like a dancing... For our Year 10 formal rehearsals, he was the guy that was coordinating it. So when we were like practicing with it, once a week.
They love
once a week for like a month leading up to the formal. He was the guy that was coordinating it. And I hadn't seen that movie. I hadn't seen Strictly Ballroom at this point. But he mentioned Dancing with the Stars like while he was giving us lessons. I think we were like acting up and weren't following the moves or something. And he got really huffy and said, I'm on Dancing with the Stars. It's like the highest rated TV show on Channel 7 or something like that.
Oh no.
And then I realized, oh, okay. And I looked at Dancing with the Stars. I'm like, oh my God, that guy's my dancing teacher. And then I watched Strictly Ballroom and goes, oh, that's that guy.
Oh, right.
Dancing with the Stars. Oh. And just rewatching it in the last week or so, I'm like, oh, that guy. Paul Mercurio taught me for like a couple of weeks in Year 10.
The thing is, Paul Mercurio was actually a ballet dancer, like classical ballet and a bit of jazz. That was his background. He was not a ballroom dancer.
Right, he had to learn it all, I read. Yeah.
Oh, you can definitely see that in some of his leaps. Like, when he's leaping around Fran. That's ballet.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
definitely ballet.
Right, yeah. A lot of his dance is very ballet. Which is, I think, the idea. I want to do different stuff, not traditional. But so I have a weird little thing with this movie in that I'd heard of it and I never had all that much interest, so I never saw it. But The song it ends with, John Paul Young's Love is in the Air. That was originally from 1978, I think, and it actually went top 10 in the U.S., top 5 in Australia, and I didn't really know it because I was 10 at the time. But when this movie came out, it was re-recorded and re-released, and there was actually some dance mixes, a Strictly mix and a Ballroom mix, and it became a huge hit in gay clubs, and I heard it everywhere. I don't know if it was so big in other clubs, but it became a big thing, and even now, like if you go to like what we call tea dance, which is like a dance at tea time, British tea time, like, 4, 5, 6 in the afternoon on like the weekends, or also in like resort getaways, like, your resort towns, like on the beach. But, it's a thing they do a lot, these tea dances where you play oldies, and you could almost anytime you'll go to one, you'll hear this song. Like I know this, every word of the song. And it's funny, I'd never realized it was because of this movie. So it was like the thing that it's known for. I mean, I bet if you went to any like out gay man in his like late 30s and up in America, they would know this song. But I don't, I'd never even heard of John Paul Young other than this song. It's not like anything we'd know. And in fact, it's considered pretty quintessentially Australian in that when the Olympics were there, the Sydney Olympics Games, they, in the closing ceremonies, had him there singing it. And I just saw this on YouTube, like after I watched this movie and was looking into it a little, and this song, when I was looking on YouTube for like what mix I knew of it, and they had a whole big event where they had like champion ballroom dancers come out and sing it. I mean, and dance to it. And then they had whole crowds doing it. And they even had these like giant floats of ballroom dancers with their big dresses. They made a whole big spectacle during the Olympics to be like, this is like an Australian thing. So interesting, just little side note.
Oh, no, that's because it's the same. I think in the opening ceremony, they had a stiletto on a bus with all these mini stilettos around it. Yeah, we do like our pop culture. Just backtracking a little bit. Duncan, how is your knee skid? So when it comes to like entering on a ballroom kind of scene, is it good? Like, do you have like long skid?
No. This was very rudimentary, just 1-2 step with a partner. There was no knee skidding involved, unfortunately. We didn't get to that lesson.
Oh well.
Also,
one other musical note. Can I give one more musical note real quick? Tara Maurice, who played Fran, she sang the version of Time After Time by Cyndi Lauper that's in that. So Fran sang that song, just so you know.
Ah.
We haven't actually talked about whether we like the movie and stuff like that. What we thought of it.
I think we can all say that we like it.
I liked it, but I thought it was like a little shallow and a little light, and I found it was like kind of predictable. Like it was very much.
Also, what makes it so good, especially because the Babadook and Walking Fright.
Right. It was definitely light and very good contrast to the movies we're watching here. But I mean, I just felt like at no point did I not know exactly where this was going. Like it seemed like I was watching a movie I've seen 10 times before, like a Disney classic, like very light. And
again, it also makes it feel very cozy.
Yeah. I think of the 4 movies, to me, it was probably the movie with like the least kind of to talk about in terms of thematic substance or whatever. Yeah. But I think what I liked about it was how it's a very sort of heightened and intense. I think the best part of it is kind of the aesthetic and the dancing, obviously. And the whole movie almost feels like a dance, like all the emotions and all the yelling and all the quickness and the sharpness of the relationships are kind of, they almost have the heightened nonsensical reality of a dance. Everyone's toiling around and so I like that style was very unique, I thought.
Definitely. No, actually, I chose this one because it had such a big critical acclaim, and it's actually still one of Australia's top 10 highest grossing pictures.
Which is an interesting point because a lot of these movies didn't do well financially, but this did.
Yeah. No, but then again, this one, it has very wide appeal. And it does have parts of it that are Australian. So that's like the Hills Hoy clothesline. That's a typically Australian.
Is it?
And also the sort of the immigrant experience of Fran. The fact that she's trying to fit into this very
different world, and she's
different world, but also this kind of authorized and rule-bound kind of world. But she takes inspiration from her parents and from her old country and injects that energy into this, so that they're sort of getting a new point of view and injecting that into the experience and introducing spontaneity and what I mean. The ultimate message of the ultimate message of the film seems to be, you don't dance to win a competition, you dance because you love it, and that's kind of the kind of climax of fun at the end where everyone's dancing, which is interesting because usually in these movies it would end with they won the competition and that's the great victory. And I thought it was interesting that they ended before. We never do find out what happened, and we don't care because they're happy, you know. Dad gets to finally dance his new moves. The son gets to dance his moves. They find love. Love is in the air. And even the villain, Bill Hunter, kind of just, you know, looks around, looks at everyone having fun, and just kind of shrugs his shoulders. And it's like, everything's fine at the end. It's a very happy ending. Yes.
I am not a romantic, and I very rarely like films with this in, and very rarely does it even make me smile. So I kind of chuckled a little when he was like, you know, dancing, it's just for pretend. I'm like, you tell her. And he's like, maybe it's not pretend. And I smiled, and I'm like, good on you, Baz Luhrmann, good on you. You melt my cold icicle heart.
No, but as well, with this movie, it's more of they started out as friends, and like,
well, she had a crush on him right from the start. That was obvious, I think.
Yeah, but it's
he grew to care about her.
Yeah.
You know, one thing I thought was interesting about this was the tone the film takes, particularly with its, like, you know, kind of almost documentary style at points. And it's almost like whole sections of it are very deliberately overacted in a way that's like stylish. You know, I like that whole, like, you know, when they're trying to be over serious, and, you know, there's just a lot of stuff in there that's almost campy, but yet works for it in a weird way. Like, as I'm watching it right from the beginning, I was like, this is not the tone I was expecting. This is interesting, you know, and then, but it worked in the end, but it wasn't like what you'd expect from this kind of a movie.
Yeah, this movie is very, very light and very easily digestible, and which is why I really, really enjoy it.
But it almost pretends to be lighter than it actually is, I think, which is, I think, interesting.
Yeah, and the tone they chose for it is lighter than it could have gone, because they do have corruption in it, so they could have chosen to pick up on those themes a lot more and weigh it down with that.
Yeah, you could definitely depict the mother figure in a much darker light when she's like, putting on my happy face and putting on my, like, she's like completely falling apart mentally, and the father is like browbeaten and can't stagger out two sentences and all that. But it's a deceptively a lighter tone than the actual content of the film.
Even the, like, really dark line, like, you think I haven't had my days where I wasn't happy, you know, in my marriage. I don't remember exactly what she says, but, like, that's a really dark thing to admit to your kid, you know? But yet it was done almost campy the way it was delivered. Like, it was odd, but kind of neat.
And that's kind of the idea of tradition, and that they're feverishly hanging onto this system that clearly makes them miserable. And if they would actually just let loose and dance, they might actually be happy.
Which is what they're supposed to be doing, if you think about it.
I know, the irony.
I really loved the flashback sequences to the young dad back in his heyday, because it seemed to me it was almost cartoonish, but it also was very reminiscent of the silent era films, especially with the makeup, because it was very pale faces with very dark makeup on otherwise. Had such a great comparison between the ordinary filming that they had done and those shots.
Yeah, speaking of silent films, it's almost like a vaudevillian movie that doesn't even require the characters to speak. Like, you can read all of the emotions and all of the plot. Right. You know, having the mute button on. I mean, obviously you want the music, but it's all sort of communicated through the dancing and through the facial expressions. It's a very kind of it would probably play well in countries where they didn't even speak the language.
Yep. Actually, Baz Luhrmann has said something about that he and his, I think it was his wife, went and saw a Hindi film, and it wasn't subtitled, and none of it was in English and they couldn't understand it, but they understood everything the movie was trying to convey through the actions of the actors. So it seems interesting that he sort of did that here as well. Yeah.
It's the same.
There's other little bits, of one of the parts that just really made me laugh, probably a bit too much, because it shows my the way that I stereotype a certain type of Australian male from a certain generation. But when Bill Hunter and his missus are fooling around and he's done and she's obviously enjoying herself and he's like, no, calm down, I'm done now, kind of thing. And it was just like, oh, that's pretty much how I picture my grandparents' generation.
Oh, man.
Shouldn't have brought my grandparents up in that. That makes it.
Yeah, please don't.
I was going to say, we're going to play this for them in this podcast.
What will you do if they go around and listen? Are they still alive? Will they come and listen?
I walked into my parents once. That was enough.
Oh, bro.
Well, speaking of repressed trauma, we might move on to the next.
Wait, King!
Now that we're all in a good mood with our two fun dancing movies, let's move
go
to our final
dark.
movie. David, would you like to tell us about your pick?
Well, let's go really dark now. So my movie is called The Babadook from 2014. If it's in a word or it's in a look, you can't get rid of the Babadook. Babadook, dook. It's written and directed by Jennifer Kent, and it's based on her own short movie called Monster, which I didn't know about till Duncan told me, and I watched it. But it's the story of a widow named Amelia and her son Samuel that is obsessed with monsters, causing trouble with the neighbors and peers in school. She reads him a storybook about a monster called Mr. Babadook who comes and gets you in your house. The creature starts to appear to Samuel and then to her, keeping them both from getting sleep. It slowly starts to take over the mother, driving her crazy. Or so it seems. She attacks Samuel and kills the dog, and eventually she takes control over the monster and locks it in the basement. Then she keeps it controlled in that basement. That's the quick version because it's a lot deeper than that. But what I love about this movie is that it uses many of the typical horror movie tropes that we expect, but it's used in a very different way, and it's much deeper and more meaningful. It's very, very smart horror. We can, and I'm sure will, discuss exactly what the Babadook stands for. And watching it for the second time, it made these points even more clear to me. In fact, the Babadook himself actually appears very little in the movie and less than I remembered from having watched it the first time. It seemed like it was all-encompassing. And when I look at it again, it actually is very rarely even seen or mentioned or anything. So, and that was one of the things I took from watching it again that I thought was really cool. So, what did the rest of you think about it? I know Donna was not looking forward to a horror movie.
I can say with all honesty, I only fast-forwarded through 4 seconds. Also, fuck you, David. Fuck you for making me watch this film.
I agree. I do not appreciate the cockroaches in this film at all.
That was a little creepy.
At all.
As I was just watching this a little while ago, I was eating Chinese food, and I guess a piece or two of rice had fallen on my shirt. And just after the cockroach scene, I leaned forward and the rice fell off onto my arm, and I jumped.
Actually,
oh my God.
I'm glad you suffered a little. I'm really glad you suffered a little.
Mum and I were watching it, and then we paused it to go do some stuff, and she went outside and fed the dogs, and coming in, a gecko jumped on her head and then jumped down onto her shorts, and this was right after the cockroach scene. She screamed a lot.
Oh yeah, I mean, I almost screamed. I can't with my neighbors.
Yeah.
Did you like it though?
I did enjoy this film. It was really well done. Essie Davis is a national treasure.
And
her acting was phenomenal.
Game of Thrones reference. She played, Lady Crane, like the Cersei actor.
Oh
yes.
I knew her from somewhere. Oh, okay.
And Miss Fisher, which is a kind of
Fisher.
Agatha Christie-esque Australian TV series.
Oh, is it Australian?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah.
That's why the movie has to be crowdfunded, because we don't have a BBC tax like England does. So the ABC was like, we do want to do this film, but we don't have enough money. And people were like, public, and it got funded very quickly. Anyway, but I did really enjoy it. It was very well done. The symbolism was really good, even down to the ending of her having to care for her grief. And that's how you move past it. And she is. Like, it's not like the Babadook was vanquished. It's still always there, but she now has to care for it, and that's what keeps it in control, which I really like. But then again, a child making weapons, I would have sent him to a psychiatrist a lot quicker.
Right?
Yeah, and it wasn't just a few small weapons. One of them actually did have darts. That's the big one where it's like, no.
And he brought
it's
one to
not
school.
Just like air quote weapons. It's actually, this could seriously hurt someone.
I was surprised that not only did they just took him out of school instead of, like, I don't know, sicking some authorities on them. Especially after, like, the car accident. See,
No, but
they did get child services come around.
Cool.
Yeah, they kind of came, looked around, and said, "Okay, we'll be back in a few weeks." Like, even
We'll
after
be
she
back
says
in a
and they're
week.
and the kids on drugs during the day to sleep, like.
No,
it was also
more...
so very well acted. At no point did I feel like she was a bad mother. And a lesser actress would have done that. Like, you get the extremes of sleep deprivation, and this effect that the Babadook is having on her is why she says these horrible things, and then she realizes, and as someone who has gone through some pretty extreme, like, sleepless periods, it was really well done. Like, she knows these thoughts aren't her own, and it's
well, are
really
they?
fantastic.
That's I think a question we need to get to, but we'll get to that. We don't have to right now, but that's an important question.
They aren't her own at her best,
aren't they? Aren't they?
They aren't what she'd normally have, is what you're trying to say.
Yeah, like, at her best, she would not think that about her son, but she wasn't at her best, and those thoughts do creep in.
But that's the point. That's the point.
I think that's what makes it an amazing movie. And I think, like, rewatching this movie, I liked it even better the second time. I think it's one of my favorite horror movies, because the horror isn't necessarily the monster. The monster is just like an expression of something far deeper. And it's the horror of, like, parenthood and motherhood and and having to care for someone and having to love someone who you don't actually love and actually grow to slowly resent and despise, and, like, that little kid just screaming constantly. Like, it's an incredibly shot film. The aesthetic and, like, the sound design is amazing, because you get such an acute sense of, like, a slowly deteriorating perspective. Like, the noise is relentless. The kid is so chaotic. She can never catch him. She can never get him to do what she wants him to do. The housework is piling up, the dishes, the cockroaches coming out of the walls. It's suffocating. It's like this. It's such a perfect representation of, like, again, with the whole gothic thing, like this slowly deteriorating mind. It's amazing design.
Yeah, I agree. Did you catch, when you watched it the second time, did you feel like the Babadook was less of a presence or more the second time?
It is. It barely appears. I was horrified. It's a horror film way before the Babadook shows up. It's a horror film from, like, the first scene.
Right.
She is going slowly insane. Right. Like, when the Babadook appears, it's like it's a natural manifestation of what she's already experiencing. And I think that's an interesting question. What does the Babadook represent? Because it sort of represents a few different
whole
things.
lot of things, I think.
It's this sort of blank space that can't quite be quantified. Because the film, it seems to be very much about trauma. Like, this traumatic event happened and she can't deal with it. She keeps having these flashbacks to it. It's a very sort of unformed, undigested, unencoded kind of sensory experience that she refuses to acknowledge or deal with, and that wound is sort of slowly festering into her life.
We should point out that's her husband's death, just in case anyone.
Yeah, and it's specifically tied to the child, because they're driving to the hospital when the car crashes. He dies, and then later the boy is born, and she has to bring up a kid on her own, which she's definitely not able to deal with. And I guess postpartum depression, you could also see the monster as being that, and a whole range of things. And
anytime she looks at him, she has to see what in some ways he took from her. Because, I mean, you can't blame the kid for this, but if they hadn't been driving to the hospital to have him, then the father wouldn't have died. The husband wouldn't have died. So it's like, she has to on some level blame him. And I mean, she won't even let him have his own birthday party because she doesn't want to celebrate. It's so messed up on so many levels, like even before she starts to go, a little loony.
Jennifer Kent, the director, had a good quote where she says, I'm not saying we all want to go and kill our kids, but a lot of women struggle. And it's a very taboo subject to say that motherhood is anything but a perfect experience for women.
Right. I was going to get there. I love that quote. Because I had my own feelings about what the Babadook was the first time I watched it, which was, about grief and depression and PTSD and all of that. But I think when you add that quote in there and watching it the second time with that quote in mind, you see how, it really is a lot of it, I think, not just grief, but her own feelings, her repressed anger at him, at the kid. We shouldn't blame, on Game of Thrones, and the Song of Ice and Fire books, is it fair for Tywin to blame Tyrion? But, that's a natural thing to be angry about. And I don't think she can help it. And then you add this, crazy out of control child that's loud and uncontrollable, and she's got to resent him and be mad, and on some level she probably wants him gone. Not on a conscious level, and like you said, not on her best day, but when we say the things she says to him, I think everything she says to him in the movie is sincere and real. It's just not a truth she wants to admit, and it's one she has to deal with and eventually does. I think she does want him to eat shit. She does want him to die. She is mad at him, and she's angry, and then she's guilty about that, and she should be. It's an awful, awful, horrible thing to think.
Yeah.
The thing is as well, I don't think she hadn't fully come to terms with her husband's death. And most parents, not everyone, but most parents work as part of a team, and she has never been able to. The whole time she has had him, it has always been a one-woman job, and I think he might have ADD or ADHD, which is why he acts that way, and obviously he has not been diagnosed. You don't think so?
Sorry.
You just think he's acting out?
No. Where we see because it's very much a cold open, he's been doing this Babadook shit for a while. He's been seeing the Babadook for a while, and we just... Yeah, the movie starts when she starts becoming aware of it. And that's probably why it feels like horror from the start, because this kid's already been living in a horror film. Of
his mother.
And she's just becoming... Yeah, not even that, because the Babadook in the film is an entity, an actual thing. We see it. It interacts with the kid, and then she can see it, and he says... he can see it on the car when she finally sees it on the car, kind of thing. So in the premise of the film, I would say that he does have some very bad behavior, but I wouldn't put any diagnoses. And I said Guy Pearce was ADHD, so I'm a hypocrite. I'm aware. Before anyone else points it out, but especially for a kid that young that is living with, trauma and not the best home life, because you even hear in her conversations with her sister, she's like, I'm over his death. I never talk about him. I never bring him up.
Which means she's not over.
Because there's a difference between being over something and in denial, and she's very much in denial. So she's just kind of compartmentalized this horrible thing. It comes out in her dreams, so she can just carry on for her son. And her anger towards the mum for having to not, because she can't go to the gym anymore. She's like, that must be so hard for you.
I know.
How do you even survive? I just love that scene. I think that's fantastic.
It's such a great line, yeah.
I feel, I know a lot of parents who have had moments like that where they just want to scream at other parents because they're not aware. Yeah, just and they are judgmental moms. Her sister has had a really easy time. And, she's like, oh, I try, but I can't even stand your kid. It's what
an awful thing to say to a mother,
Yeah, where were you?
Horrible thing.
But
get-go.
This kid
and that's why Ryan
crazy. Here's a question. So do you think that he was this bad before she started acting up, or do you think she's always acted up and that's made him be this way? Because it is a fair point. I didn't think so, but I think you've got a good point.
I think it's meant to be ambiguous because he does start talking about the monster, but he doesn't start calling it the Babadook
until the book.
Until the book.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Until the book.
And he's obsessed with the monster already.
Well, I think what he's articulating is something that's happening in the mother. Like, he can sense this growing rage or this growing violence cultivating in the mother, and he doesn't know what to do with it, and he thinks it's something that's taking over the mother, and he needs to protect the mother from it. So I think it is, I mean, you could argue he's got behavioral issues, and that's what one of the teachers comments, but I think the film was meant to say to us that he's this way because his mother isn't able to deal with something, or is treating him in a way that sort of formed this behavior in him, and made him afraid of something that is irreconcilably a part of her.
Yeah, and his misbehaviors aren't misbehaviors in a sense that he just hasn't listened and he doesn't care. When he misbehaves, it's, he builds more weapons because he knows, like, he feels like something is coming and he needs to be able to protect his mum. When he calls the next door neighbor, it's because he's afraid for his mum. Like, he is definitely reacting towards her. So I don't know if putting on like a diagnosis to him would help at all when it's reacting to the situation that he's in.
But it's also a result of her parenting, because we see him just acting crazy, irrespective of trying to defeat some monster, like when he climbs up on top of that swing set. Like, the mother has not set she's not raised him in a way in which she's setting boundaries. She's just constantly indulging him.
And I don't think she's in a position to be capable of setting boundaries. You know, it's a horrible spot to be put in. Like,
so do you think the Babadook happened? Do you think there was some creature that she either summoned or something, or do you think it's completely in her mind?
The book is pretty good evidence that it's something supernatural. I don't think she made that book.
But it didn't come back after she burnt it, so it might... Do you think it could be her sleepwalking, potentially? Like, and then hallucinating? But in saying that, I do like the fact it's actually something there. And I almost think that, like, do you think it's the father's ghost? And because she had not processed it properly, he was acting out in that way.
A supernatural manifestation, whatever Tolkien says about allegory. Like, I think it is an allegory for grief, but within the premise of the film, it is a being.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is supernatural, and I think it is a being acting upon her, but I don't think it's a being that's come from anything but her. Like, it's not a monster that's come from the outside. It's a monster produced from her own grief and her own and all that.
Yeah, because as well, it only harms her son, and she harms the dog, really. It did nothing to the next door neighbor, even when she saw it in the next door neighbor's house, and when the next door neighbor came and visited her.
This was definitely a film I had to watch during the day, because when you did see the Babadook,
creepy.
And for a regular horror film, I'd probably have to fast forward through about 10 minutes, because I don't like jump scares. I don't like any of that crap.
And there were too many.
Sorry, Duncan, but it's probably not crap. But they've done so badly, and it's horror for horror's sake, and I really dislike it. But then the Babadook does it in a way where I only need to fast forward through like 4 seconds, because it's so atmospheric, and it's when you see like the shears come out, like I kind of need to turn my back, because I realize I have a corner that I'm not seeing in my room. There we go.
A lot of horror films, I mean, there's not too much of the monster. Like, it's quite it's quite sort of less is more. It is much more about atmosphere. You only see the monsters a few times, but in another way, the monster goes much further than other monsters in other movies, where often the monster appears, but then the protagonist will get away. Whereas here, you actually see this terrifying shot of the monster like entering her, and it's like she's infected with the monstrosity in a way, and there's literally nowhere to run. It's in her house, it's inside her. There is no escape. And that's frightening. And I think I do want to touch a little bit on the design of the monster. It is very much a sort of amorphous blob. You don't get a sense, and that works really well with the theme of trauma, the idea that it's something it hasn't been encoded into memory. It is this sort of psychic gap, this psychic wound.
It's not defined.
It's constantly bleeding out. But I think the design of the movements are really creepy, and I think Kent used this kind of stop motion technique where it's she's sort of capturing stills of the image moving and then sort of threading them together. So it has this really janky, creepy, artificial movement to it. And there's also a creepy moment where she's watching television and it appears in like a silent
a bunch of times
film or
like 4 or 5 times. 4 or 5 times it appears.
Again, when she's looking through the window and she sees it in her neighbor's lounge room. So that kind of, it's almost a cinematic effect, the sort of interposing of the image in scenes of otherwise normal domesticity. So it's adding this something that like Gothic Australian texts, they refer to as the malice of the ordinary. And I think I like how a lot of the horror is embedded in really sort of mundane domestic things like doing the dishes and even the ritual of reading a storybook to your child. Like it's something she does over and over again, and suddenly it's an aspect of horror has entered it.
Eating food and finding glass in it.
And what would that not be the worst kids book ever?
Like it's not this spectacular kind of monster arriving, it sort of seeps in subtly through this kind of repetitive domestic thing that you don't even think about, and suddenly it's there.
Yep.
Whoever made that book is like the production person on it just did such a fantastic job, especially when like she slits her own throat and the like that.
Oh my god.
Yeah. Oh, that was brilliant.
So good. And what you were saying, like with the popping up in TV and the more advanced that it gets, like I definitely do think it's a supernatural entity that has come from her, because when she's watching the probably didn't even happen, the woman that stabbed her son, and she sees herself in the window.
Yep.
So creepy.
Right.
And it's a smile, and it's so frozen.
Yeah.
Guys, did you notice with the Babadook, when it has its physical manifestation, its outfit actually looks a lot like what her son wears when he's being a magician, because it has the cape, the top hat, and he's wearing sequin gloves, but he gives his fingers a similar shape to...
That's a really good...
Ooh. Yeah. And
I like it.
The Babadook's face shape is actually quite similar to the son's face shape.
I did not catch it. Interesting.
And in the picture book, the wardrobe in the son's room, the features on it, they have some carvings on it that actually looks like the Babadook's eyes in the picture book.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm going to make the argument that the creature did not exist at all. My feeling, this I would not have said the first time I watched it. This is watching it the second time, kind of trying to figure this out as I'm watching it, like thinking through it rather than just experience. Like the first time I watched it, I just experienced it as a horror movie, probably how Sarah and Donna did, you know. But this time I was really trying to look for like meaning, and I feel like honestly, it's all in her head. For one thing, I think she wrote the book. You know, we have the bit that she's a writer, and, you know, you'd argue, you know, you don't put things on the wall unless they're there for a reason. I feel like she's a writer, and they said, I want to get back to that. So I feel like she wrote this book. I don't know, you know, whether she did it sleepwalking or just she's, you know, blocked it out or whatever. But I feel like somehow she did. And that's why it came back, because who else would know that it's in the, you know, that it was ripped up in the back? I mean, yeah, I guess the creature could have known, but I feel like, and the thing that makes it clearest to me is the fact that, remember, she saw all the bugs coming out of the back, but then when the social workers look, it's all repaired. Like, I mean, she could have repaired it herself, but she was in the middle of doing that at the time, so I don't feel like because she even went back looking for it. Like, look, there's bugs in the wall. And so if she fixed it, she doesn't remember fixing it. Or maybe there were bugs in the wall, but she fixed it, but she doesn't know. I don't know. But I feel like all of it, because when I watched it a second time, I noticed that anything the Babadook does is something in her head. Remember, it's all from her point of view. You know, we almost never see Samuel by himself. So it's not like we know that, like, the Babadook did something to her while she's asleep or while she's away or whatever. Like, it's all from her point of view. The car scene, all of that is her seeing it. You know, we know he sees it, but what is he really seeing? Is he seeing his mom? Is he seeing, you know what I mean? And I don't think there's anything in that basement. I think that she goes down there and she imagines it. And that's one of the reasons she doesn't let Samuel down there.
I think that's definitely a valid reading. It could just be all in her head, because there's several points where she sees something and then someone else looks at it and it's not there. So it's an unreliable narrator, or it's an unreliable subjectivity in that sense. It's just her going through that process and seeing those images to justify it. But I did want to just touch on the ending briefly. I think that's a really interesting idea, that you can't really get rid of the Babadook, whatever it means. You just have to learn to accept that it's a part of you, and you have to like keep it in balance, and you have to acknowledge, you can't deny
and feed it.
Acknowledge something. Feed it, yeah. You have to acknowledge that it happened and it's a part of you, but that doesn't mean it has to define you.
Right. And I do love that you can see this many different ways, that all of us can look at it and get a different meaning, and watching it twice gives you a different idea. And I think all of our interpretations are equally valid, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, that ending is powerful, though. Did the rest of you watch the short movie, too, that it was based on?
I'm not watching more horror movies than I have to.
Well, yeah, it's only like 9 minutes. So. It was only 9 minutes.
It's scary.
So.
It's scary, though.
Right. I watched A Walk in Fright, and then straight after it, I watched The Babadook. And I watched both with Mum, and after that, we're watching, we went and we found a comedy Korean drama movie, and we're watching this.
You should have liked Priscilla in between.
No, I'd already watched the other two. I watched those two first, and then I watched
Ooh, rookie mistake.
I did Wake in Fright first and say Babadook for last.
If you want the antidote to the Babadook, it's the castle.
Okay.
One thing that's in your notes that I actually wanted to mention, just because it's funny, is how the Babadook has strangely become an LGBT icon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know where that came from? Was basically Netflix. Netflix accidentally listed it somewhere as when you have your if you're looking for women-based movies, or you're looking for movies in horror, and for some reason someone accidentally tagged it as an LGBT movie, and someone discovered this online and thought it was hysterical, and all these memes started popping up of gay Babadook with with his weird creepy look and his hat, and then a rainbow flag or something. And I know at the time, having seen the movie, I thought it was hysterical just because it's so ridiculously bizarre and inappropriate that I was like, I love this, and I put that as my Facebook profile picture for a while, and a lot of people did. And in fact, people showed up this year at Pride, around the world, dressed as the Babadook. These
talking
irony.
about Pride. It is the 40th anniversary for Sydney Mardi Gras.
Yep.
Talking about Sydney LGBTQI stuff, and
always wanted to go.
Yeah.
I don't think people are really seriously thinking it. I think it's just funny because it's so bizarre and inappropriate. And then I think it also makes fun of the fact that there are these weird, and I think a lot of cultures have that where you take something and make it an icon. There's a lot of LGBT icons that maybe shouldn't be, but for some bizarre reason become it. And that's why I thought it was so funny that the Babadook becomes one, because it's completely ridiculous, but I kind of like it.
As Duncan said before, sequins make everything better. Sequins and rainbow flags might make the Babadook less scary.
Right. There was some meme about who was it? Some other.
Oh yeah, wasn't it the Babadook and dating. The Babadook and It? Pennywise from It.
Pennywise, yes. Babadook and Pennywise were a couple.
A couple.
How did that happen? Why?
Just a meme that's funny.
Shits and giggles. Okay, just shits and giggles. Cool.
Oh no, totally. The whole. I mean, no, this was a huge meme. For 2 years, for a year and a half, it became a big thing because everyone just thought it was funny and bizarre. Especially with the way the Babadook looks, because it's such a bizarre, and you got to give them credit too. Very creatively drawn, and the look of it is very unmistakable. I think the Babadook on some levels will become a horror icon.
After watching all these Australian films, they all just have so much to do with community, community that you create, community that you find yourself in, family that you create, that you're forced to have, in Strictly Ballroom. She doesn't appreciate, that's wrong. Her father doesn't appreciate her until that, so she's forced to be in a family that doesn't feel loving and all that kind of thing. And there's so much about isolation and loneliness as well, which is interesting.
In all four of these movies. In all four of them.
Yeah. that was my takeaway.
Themes. Overarching themes.
Oh, yeah. I feel proud.
One quick weird note about this movie, by the way, is that just on a meta level, not in the movie itself, but in America, they actually released the movie online the same day that it was put into theaters. And it was mostly in like smaller, like art house theaters, but they actually released it online the same day, which is an interesting distribution idea to be like, well, you know, if you want to just watch it now, you can. You don't have to go to the theater. And apparently it did pretty well. It didn't do like great in the theaters, but it probably made a good amount of money online, and a lot of people have watched it. So
yeah, it's very much a word of mouth kind of movie. Like people, so a few people watched it, and it was a cool concept, and the Babadook is just a catchy name, I guess, and it was just spread very slowly but surely and became a hit.
And the visual makes for good memes, you know, because it's such an iconic. Like you can't really confuse the Babadook with any other character, really. I mean, nothing.
The idea of a horror picture book is just so cool.
It is. It's really.
I work in a library, and I'm trying to get a copy of it and hide it somewhere.
Actually,
put it in the kids section and traumatize some kids.
Well, I don't want to create I don't want to create another Babadook.
Maybe
not. Oh
not.
my god, that would be funny.
But how much about the Babadook that is terrifying is because it was on a very, very small budget, so she didn't have the money to do things that she might have wanted to do and see the monster more. So because it was on such a tight budget, she used her money so well and so effectively. But would it have been a different movie if she had $10 million instead of 1.5?
She said she did it deliberately that way. She deliberately chose to make it stop motion, and that was the visual she wanted. So I think if she'd had the money, it might have looked a little different, but not much. I think we would have gotten pretty much what we got.
Yeah, I can't imagine this movie being better. Like it's just the perfect realization of what it needs to be. It's small, it's intimate, it's beautifully photographed, it's atmospheric. I wouldn't change a thing about it.
And in fact, if you see the original 10-minute movie, it is a little more. First of all, you see the Babadook more percentage-wise because it's only a 9-minute movie and it's in it for maybe half of it. But you do see it actually is a little more realistic in the pre-movie than in what they eventually did. So she actually, I think, downgraded the quote-unquote realism factor when she went for the big budget movie.
It's more corporeal, like it has a face. It's more like the Ring Lady. It's one of those sort of ghosts.
Yeah.
This is much more, you don't quite understand what it is. It's just a kind of black cloak with eyeballs. It's almost comical.
Mm-hmm.
What happens with Daniel Henshaw in the end, the guy that plays the work colleague that has a crush on her?
We never see him
I
again.
think we find out.
Yeah, he gives her the flowers and then the kid freaks out and then he's gone.
That was sad.
I know, right?
Sad. So I'm a little bit biased because I really like the actor because he was in 10 Washington Spies playing
he was cute.
Caleb Brewster, and he's very charming. And then I realized he's in Snowtown.
Don't watch Snowtown.
Not going to watch Snowtown. Yeah.
You either, Sarah.
Is it full of cockroaches?
No.
Very graphic.
Barrels.
Human cockroaches.
Oh, God,
Yeah.
no. Okay. No, thank you. Thanks for the warning.
But how does he go as Bunting? Like, I haven't seen him in anything where he's menacing. And
Oh, he's amazing. He's
really?
one of the greatest Australian movie villains.
Yeah, I have no idea who he even is.
Oh, wow.
It's a serial killer.
Is he?
It's a famous South Australian serial killer.
What's the name again?
That he played.
Oh, okay.
That he played. The movie is Snowtown. It's about some murders that occurred in the 90s,
Mhm.
and he plays the main role.
Because they were killing gays and stuffing their bodies in barrels.
Cool.
Yeah, South Australia. We know you're not.
All South Australians are serial killers.
Have
PSA.
Have crossovers. He can play someone who kills like one of the Priscilla girls. No.
I've met many South Australians who were not serial killers.
Yeah, I have no
Have
idea.
you?
I don't know.
I hope Jennifer Kent makes more movies. I hope she doesn't disappear. Because a lot of Australian filmmakers seem to just make 1 or 2 movies, and then they just go into producing or TV directing or something. So
I'm
she makes more stuff.
Is that because we
Hollywood
have more of a market for TV than we do for movies, though? Unless they make it really
funding
big.
from Screen Australia or state funding. So, with this one, this was Screen Australia. And then they can't apply for funding for another year or so they can't get it multiple times in a row. which is good because it prevents favoritism, but it also means that they have to source their own funding for their next films, which can be incredibly hard to do.
Exactly. I mean, people need money to work. So, like, if it takes like 3 or 4 or 5 years to make a film, they're going to need to do other stuff in the meantime. And I mean, there is like movie making in Australia, but it's often like it's either television or it's like foreign movies that come and film here for the tax breaks, and they sort of do work on that, or they'll go to Hollywood and work. But like the idea of creating their own film, it seems like it's not something where Australian directors can make a big body of work like an American director. They often have to do other work in between.
Yeah.
But because we do have Screen Australia that can see things like monsters and go, we do want to throw some cash at this because we think you're fantastic. Hopefully maybe some other funding body in the US or in Europe, or she can put on, if her next idea is fantastic and she wants to do crowdfunding, that would be available to her because of the Babadook. There are problems with it, but without it, we would be really stuffed. It would be nice to go back to like Whitlam era, free tertiary unity education and exploitation.
Yes.
This was one of the funny things about
me free
not quite
unity.
Hollywood. Because they would just give money to anything, they would just make the worst movies ever made. And they got to a point where the public was like, stop funding these terrible movies. And they just sort of, the whole operation seemed to collapse. So now it's much harder to get money for movies. Before we go, did you guys have any other podcasts that you've got coming out or that you wanted to plug?
Star Trek.
Discovery.
Star Trek?
Yeah.
Later today?
Yep, Dan and I will be doing that shortly in a few hours.
Yeah.
Back-to-back Vox.
You're going to be so sick of us.
Right. It looks like we are going to finally get off our butts and do the Doctor Who one, hopefully this week. So the end of the Capaldi era Doctor Who podcast should be happening soon, hopefully. Which ironically would have been my first ever, but never happened. My first ever.
For me, I just have the reread ones coming up. I'm on episode 61. Bina's hosting that one, so you can look forward to that. And I hosted episode 64, which is the retrospective look back at A Storm of Swords. So
isn't that being split?
Potentially. I'll see.
Well, aren't you doing another recording?
We've already done another recording, and I'm pissed off with the
Tyrell
recordings.
answers.
Tyrell's questions were answered.
I really wanted to know.
Yes.
How long was the recording?
7.5 hours with the two combined.
What?
Oh, I believe it.
Yeah.
I gave her 4 pages of Tyrell notes.
Well,
Which
you
cut
remember
down
how
to 1, which was really good.
We skipped all of the A Feast for Crows, A Dance with Dragons questions. That happened because it was 7 hours of just recorded material already without any of those. So I'm like, we aren't doing this. It can be done when we finish the whole reread. You can do them. But yeah.
We should. We got to leave something. We have years before we'll get another book. So
I love long podcasts as long as I don't have to edit them.
Right. Yeah, I have to go through all of it and fix it.
Well, I mean, can it go as like 2 or 3? Like do one that's like, say, just this area or whatever? Or
that
is it too hard?
recording is my audio jacked up in both parts of it, and one of them, everything I said, because I have 2 recorders going and no one else had any going, and in both of them, everything I said disappeared for an hour.
Oh no.
Yeah. And there was super off topic in that one, and that one was the one, that hour was the hour where they actually were sort of on topic and answered the fucking questions.
Oh no.
Gotta have other recordings.
Wait, no one else was recording?
No one else was recording. No one else ever records. Apparently I need to be the only one who ever records on everything.
We need to have like
got a recorder.
We gotta set a rule. We gotta like crack down on this. Like at least 3 per. Like if you can't, if we can't, we'll have to replace people. I mean, hopefully mine worked. We'll see with this now that I've said that. But at least I tried.
Jinxed it.
At least I tried. Okay, I tried. It's a brand new version. In fact, it's more up to date than yours. So we'll see if mine came out better or worse.
I can't believe we're like 400 plus episodes in and we're still recording 7-hour podcasts on A Song of Ice and Fire.
I know.
You'd think we'd run out of stuff to talk about.
Well,
Maybe
she said a lot of it was off topic.
No, it was they got into cat bait stuff, so I cut out like 30 minutes of that, and I'm like, that's going, goodbye. No one needs to hear that. Like,
that's
as in,
gonna be
I've cut it down from like 3 hours for that recording down to an hour. I think it's at an hour 50 at the moment without the after show stuff. And there's 50 minutes, which is the stuff I don't have any audio for what I said in, so I need to still go through that part of it.
So what are you going to do? Re-record yourself asking questions, or?
Yeah, but I also have to figure out what I said, because like I have the questions, but what I've said, I don't like. As in, I wrote down notes the stuff for what I was going to say, but depending on what other people said, changed what I would have said. So I'm like, I have no clue what I said. So how am I going to edit it?
That's one of the circles of hell.
Yep.
Right. Well, I'll tell you this: your last one you pulled off remarkably well. Everyone, even Bina gave you high praise for that. So
yeah.
That concludes our Australian movie roundtable. Let us know what you think of our picks and what your favourite Australian movie is. I'd like to thank our hosts for this evening, Sarah, Dana, and David. Thank you for listening. This has been the Vassals of Kingsgrave, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye.
bye.
Thank you.